Hey guys, tonight we're crawling back through time, lace collars, coal smoke, creepy dolls and all to take a little bedtime tour through Victorian parenting. And just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Like literally, if you were born in 1850, the odds were stacked pretty high that you wouldn't make it past your 5th birthday. And even if you did, it probably involved a lot of emotional repressions and being whipped for sneezing incorrectly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps me keep the lights on, and not end up like a chimney sweep. Also, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and what time it is down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're a kid in Victorian England. Congratulations, you're probably cold, you're definitely not coddled. And if you so much as look a grown-up in the eye the wrong way, you're going to feel the sting of what they call moral correction. We're talking birch rods, canes, belts, shoes, or the classic, Dad's bare hand. Corporal punishment wasn't just allowed, it was expected. A child who wasn't whipped every now and then was seen as neglected. That should give you an idea of where this is going. There's no sugar-coating it. Discipline was the cornerstone of Victorian child-rearing. Children were not viewed as little humans with thoughts and feelings. They were blank slates, or worse, little savages, needing to be tamed. This was especially true in the more religious households where the idea of original sin meant you were already born kinda evil. So, naturally, your parents had to beat the sin out of you before it took root. How comforting. Let's imagine a normal Tuesday. You wake up, if you slept at all, on a thin straw mattress in a chilly nursery. Your hands are folded over the blanket just so, because you've already learned what happens when they're not. Maybe you're 4, maybe you're 6. Either way, someone barges in, yanks back the curtains, and barks at you to stand up straight and stop blinking so loud. Your day hasn't started, and you already feel like a criminal. Breakfast? Maybe. But only if your behaviour yesterday was impeccable. If not, it's bread and water. Or just water. You eat in mons. Elbows off the bowl. Chew with your mouth closed. Don't fidget, don't smile too much, don't not smile. Basically, exist as little as possible. Now let's say you do something objectively mild, like accidentally knock over your cup. That's it, you've broken the seal. The governess or your father or whoever is in charge that morning reaches for the cane. It's not even a dramatic event, it's just maintenance, like flossing your teeth. A few whacks on the back of the legs and you're back in line. Interestingly, this type of punishment wasn't reserved just for the poor. Even wealthy households with their wallpapered nurseries and delicate china dished it out regularly. Actually, sometimes especially the wealthy. Because for them, appearances were everything. If you were a nobleman's child, you were being trained like a show pony. You needed to be flawless in manners, posture and silence. So if you mispronounced a word, that might earn you a mouthful of soap, or a full hour standing with your face to the wall. Or, you guessed it, a spanking with something creatively awful, like a riding crop or silver-handled cane. Here's where things get a bit more bizarre. Some experts of the day believed that children didn't feel pain the way adults do, that their nerves hadn't fully developed, so they weren't really suffering. That belief gave permission to beat them as hard as needed without feeling bad. Modern science, of course, says that's complete nonsense, but it does explain how so many adults manage to sleep at night. And while all this sounds terrifying, what's even creepier is how ritualized it became. There were manuals, literal parenting guides, teaching how to spank properly. One of the more popular ones advised that the child should be spanked until a sense of moral shame is achieved. Not just pain, moral shame. There's your Victorian bedtime story. Of course, not everyone agreed. There were early critics of corporal punishment, even in the 1800s, though their voices were usually drowned out by louder ones quoting the Bible and praising the rod. A few progressive thinkers started to suggest that, hey, maybe kids need affection, maybe terror isn't the best motivator. But these ideas were considered fringe at the time, almost dangerous. Letting a child feel loved without condition was seen as reckless. It might give them ideas. And if you're wondering, no, this wasn't just about punishment, it was about control. The entire household, from the screaming toddler to the grumpy old butler, functioned on strict hierarchies. Children were the lowest rung, even below the dog in many cases. They had no say, no rights, and no real identity outside of the family name. Discipline ensured they stayed in their place. It was parenting as policing. One quirky side note. Some Victorian families would take before and after drawings of their kids when they'd been punished. Like actual hand-drawn sketches showing Johnny before correction and Johnny after. These were displayed proudly. Look what a well-behaved, hollow-eyed child we have now, frame it. So where does all this leave you? Well, assuming you don't spill your soup, cry too loudly, forget your table manners, or dare to act like an actual child, you might make it to bedtime without being struck. But even then, you'll be tucked into a bed too small, under a window that's probably open. Victorians loved a fresh draft. And left to reflect on how to be better tomorrow. Or else. And that's just the start. Tomorrow you might get punished for speaking without permission, or for asking a question, or, worst of all, for playing too loudly. But we'll get to that. You don't talk at the table, you don't talk in the drawing room, you don't talk unless someone taller than you says your name first, and even then, you'd better hope your voice doesn't crack or sound impertinent. Welcome to the golden rule of Victorian parenting. Children should be seen, not heard. It's not a suggestion. It's practically a survival strategy. And tonight, you're going to master it, while staring at the wall in total silence for 3 hours. Let's rewind a bit. The phrase wasn't invented by the Victorians, but oh boy, did they make it a lifestyle. Every proper household raised children to be invisible like little human pieces of furniture. You're decorative, polite, quiet, clean, and ideally not breathing too loud. It starts as soon as you're old enough to form words. If you have thoughts or questions, save them for your diary and hope no one finds it. You're a child in a middle-class Victorian home. It's mid-afternoon and you're sitting in the corner parlour on a floral upholstered settee that's probably less comfortable than it looks. Your ankles are crossed, your hands are folded. You're wearing your stiff Sunday best because the neighbours might stop by and heaven forbid they see a smudge on your cuff. You're expected to behave like a little adult, but without any of the adult privileges. You can't weigh in on conversations. You can't leave without permission. You can't laugh at a joke unless someone older laughs first. Think of it as social boot camp where every mistake is a punishable offence, and even your existence feels like an intrusion. If you're unlucky, someone will ask you to recite something. A hymn, a poem, a French phrase. It's not a game, it's a test. You stand up, palms sweating, and deliver your lines while your parents nod with cold approval, or narrow their eyes if you stammer. One wrong word and it's back to your room to copy out the Lord's Prayer 20 times in ink that smells like scorched metal. And what if you just want to be a child? Let's say you spot your younger sibling making a funny face across the room and you let out a giggle. No screaming, no running, just a soft giggle. Suddenly the atmosphere changes. You hear the sharp clearing of a throat. A silver spoon clinks too hard against a porcelain teacup. That's your cue. You're dismissed from the room without a word, led by a nanny whose face could outstern a gargoyle. Upstairs you go to sit alone and reflect on your behaviour. Fun times. Now here's the twist. This wasn't just happening in households. Schools, churches, even public parks followed the same logic. If you were a child out in public and made noise, people stared. Not the concerned kind of stare we do today when a toddler's having a meltdown in Target. No, this was a judgmental, bone-marrow-freezing kind of stare that communicated a clear message. Control your offspring or remove them from society. In the classroom, silence was law. A teacher's voice filled the room. Yours did not. If you were called on, you stood next to your desk like a miniature soldier and responded in a tone just above a whisper. Mispronounce arithmetic. That's a ruler to the knuckles, or asked for clarification. A longer lecture on impudence. It was less about learning and more about being conditioned to obey. Of course, some kids rebelled. Some whispered during lessons, snuck books into their laps, carved initials into wood desks, or passed scribble notes that were more daring than funny. But when they were caught, the punishment was designed to make an example of them. Not just to deter them, but to terrify everyone else. Victorian discipline didn't aim to fix mistakes. It aimed to prevent them from ever forming. One particularly bizarre fringe belief: talking too much, especially for girls, was considered a moral failing. A chatty child was labelled unwomanly, unladylike, or worst of all, forward. And in Victorian England, forward was practically code for doomed. Parents trained their daughters to smile prettily and speak only when spoken to, ideally in a voice no louder than a breeze through curtains. Boys, meanwhile, were expected to become stoic gentlemen. That meant learning to suppress feelings, speak only when necessary, and walk around like a miniature parliamentarian. If you asked too many questions, you were nosy. If you told a story, you were boastful. If you cried, well, we'll get into that whole disaster later, but for now, just know, silence was safer than expression. One fun historical fact: etiquette books for children were an actual publishing industry. Tiny volumes with gold leaf and floral covers, filled with instructions like, do not speak until your elders have concluded their conversation, and never interrupt, even if you have good reason. Some had little moral fables tucked in where noisy children ended up lost, unloved, or, no joke, dead. Sleep tight, kids, but not everyone agreed with this culture of silence. A small number of thinkers, John Stuart Mill comes to mind, advocated for education that encouraged reason and dialogue. Radical, right? He believed that children should learn by questioning, by discussing ideas. That a silent child wasn't necessarily a good one, just a suppressed one. Of course, most Victorian parents found this absurd and dangerous. Questioning led to disobedience. Disobedience led to chaos. Chaos led to, probably, France. Still, the cracks were beginning to show. Toward the end of the 19th century, a few progressive educators tried out new models, kinder classrooms, student-led discussions, even something wild called play-based learning. But those were outliers, quiet whispers against the roaring sermon of conformity. So what does all this mean for you, our little Victorian time traveller? It means your world is one of performance and pressure. You're always on stage, never off script. Off script. You memorise the lines, hit your marks, and hope nobody notices your humanity peeking out. If you're lucky, your parents might murmur a rare "well done" before returning to their adult conversation. But don't worry, tomorrow you'll be banished to the nursery for having too much fun. We'll get into that next. It's late afternoon now, and you've been banished not because you screamed or spilled ink or knocked over a vase, but because you smiled too much during piano practice. A little too much enthusiasm, a little too much joy, and so off you go to the nursery. You'd think that sounds like a cosy retreat, right? Soft toys, rocking chairs, warm milk, a kindly nanny humming lullabies. But no, Victorian nurseries were less like sanctuaries and more like pastel-coloured holding cells where children went to be out of the way. You don't go there to relax. You go there because the adults don't want to look at you anymore. Let's open the door and step inside. The air smells faintly of starch and old soap. The wallpaper is probably floral, slightly peeling, and there's a fire that looks comforting, but don't be fooled, it's mainly for show. You're expected to stay quiet and not actually go near it. A stern warning from the nursemaid reminds you it's not your thing. It's for good behaviour only. Got it. Everything in the nursery is designed to keep you contained, both physically and emotionally. Furniture is sparse, but just uncomfortable enough to discourage lounging. The toy box is there, yes, but don't expect anything cushy or cuddly. You might find a stiff porcelain doll with glassy eyes that seem to judge your every move, or maybe a wooden horse with flaking paint and one leg mysteriously shorter than the others. There might be alphabet blocks, but only if you're of the suitable age. Don't touch anything that wasn't explicitly handed to you. That's an offence. The real boss of the nursery isn't you, of course. It's the nanny, or the nursemaid, or the governess, depending on your family's wealth and your exact age. She's in her late 30s, always in a starch-stiff uniform, and not here to chat. Think of hers as a cross between a cold school teacher and a prison warden with slightly better taste in lace. Her job is to maintain order, keep you presentable, and keep your natural instincts in check. Basically, if you're laughing too much or talking too loudly, that's a moral failure. You'll be reprimanded accordingly. And when we say nursery, don't imagine this is just where you hang out after tea. No, in most households this is where you live. You wake here, eat here, study here, nap here, and play here. You don't see your parents much. Maybe a daily visit for 10 minutes, assuming you're lucky or particularly photogenic. This room is your little world, and it's equal parts rigid routine and mild existential dread. What makes it stranger is that these nurseries often existed just a hallway or two away from lavish drawing rooms where your parents were sipping sherry and talking politics. You can hear the muffled clinking of glasses, the low drone of adult conversation, the occasional burst of polite laughter. But that world is sealed off. It's not for you. Not until you're older. And even then, maybe not. Here's a weird little historical tidbit. Some wealthier families hired specialised nursery designers to make sure the children's quarters reflected refinement and moral structure. Not comfort, structure. The layout was intentional. Beds in perfect rows, symmetrical toy shelves, clocks to signal every segment of the day. The idea was that this visual order would shape your internal order, or break your spirit. Either one, really. Let's not forget the nursery timetable, which could rival a military operation. Wake at 6:30, cold sponge bath, prayer recitation, breakfast and no talking, morning walk regardless of weather, Latin drills, silent reading, bland lunch, nap time, but only if authorised, structured play, which sounds like an oxymoron but was taken very seriously, then tea, then hygiene inspection, then bedtime, and heaven help you if your blanket isn't folded just so it lights out. Even toddlers weren't safe from the structure. Babies in nurseries were often fed on strict schedules, not when they were hungry. Crying was discouraged, punished even. Self-soothing was an expectation, not a developmental milestone. There are letters from the period describing how mothers boasted about how little they had to deal with their own infants, because the staff kept them quiet. One woman wrote proudly that her son had not been cuddled except in emergencies. I mean, yikes. And it's not like children had each other to lean on. Siblings were often separated by age and gender, assigned different rooms or even different wings of the house. You might hear your brother's footsteps above you or catch a glimpse of your sister across the courtyard, but you weren't playing together, at least not in the way we think of play now. Organised recreation? Yes. Imaginative chaos? Not a chance. Some historians argue that the nursery was actually an early experiment in behavioural conditioning. The goal wasn't to protect you, it was to mould you into a very specific kind of adult, reserved, respectable, and emotionally constipated. There were even nursery rhymes specifically created to reinforce moral lessons. You know that one about the baby falling out of the cradle? That was basically a warning. Misbehave and the laws of nature, or at least the house rules, will come for you. But not everyone agreed. Some fringe voices, early child psychologists and a few radical writers, suggested that maybe a more loving, responsive environment could raise happier, healthier children. They were mostly ignored. Victorian society had no patience for the idea that children might need affection. Affection made you weak. It distracted you from your future duties, especially if you were a boy bound for law or the clergy, or a girl being trained to marry someone twice your age. Still, even in these bleak little holding pens, a few moments of joy snuck in. Maybe a nursemaid with a soft spot lets you touch her embroidery hoops. Maybe you get to sit by the window and count the carriages clattering by. Maybe your doll winks at you in just the right way that makes the day feel survivable. Or maybe, just maybe, you pretend you're somewhere else. Somewhere with grass and freedom and no time schedules. But not for long. Dinner is in 30 minutes. You had better rehearse your hymn. Dinner is over now and you've survived without spilling anything or speaking out of turn. A small miracle, but before you can even blink, it's time for your nightly character development. Or, as it's more bluntly known, the whipping. Because in the Victorian world, punishment isn't reactive, it's proactive. It's not about what you did, it's about what you might do. The logic is like seasoning cast iron. Regular applications of pain keep things from rusting over. You haven't misbehaved today? Irrelevant. A few strikes across the back of the legs builds fortitude set. And here's the worst part. Most of the adults around you truly, sincerely believe they're doing what's best. They love you, sort of, but it's a love filtered through duty and dominance. Love in this case looks like a birch switch, kept behind the door, neatly hung on a brass hook. It might be named. Parents named their instruments of discipline. The tamer. Mr. de Birch. Mother's helper. Wholesome. You're told the pain is temporary, but the lesson will last forever. That sounds poetic until you're the one being bent over a chair while your governess lectures you in iambic pentameter about the dangers of idle minds. There's always a reason for the punishment, even if they have to invent one. A forgotten please, a loud footstep, a crooked collar, anything can be spun into a moral failing. And once the first blow lands, your guilt is assumed. You must have done something. Children don't get the benefit of the doubt here. They're just trained. Let's talk about the actual tools of the trade. First, there's the classic, the cane, thin, flexible, and cruelly efficient. The sting it delivers isn't just sharp, it lingers. Sometimes it breaks the skin. If it's your father delivering the punishment, you might get the belt. Leather, broad, swung with the casual detachment of someone who considers this part of the day. The birch rod, a bundle of twigs tied together. multiple little lashes in one go. Think of it as nature's multi-tool for child discipline. And for the unlucky, there's the infamous cat o' nine tails. It was mostly a naval punishment, sure, but it made its way into homes, especially for the reform-minded parents who believed in extreme deterrence. A few strikes from that, and you didn't just cry, you remembered. And that's the point. The pain is supposed to become part of you, woven into your memory like embroidery on a sampler. Not every child got the full force treatment. Of course, there were levels. You might be made to kneel on dried peas for half an hour. Sounds quaint until you try it. Or write lines until your wrist cramps. I will not speak out of turn. I will not fidget. I will not fidget. I will not... You get the picture. One father wrote that his son was made to copy the entire New Testament by hand as punishment. Character building or early onset carpal tunnel? You decide. And then there's the isolation. Not just physical timeouts, but emotional ones. If you cried during punishment, you were sent to your room without comfort, without dinner, and with strict orders to come down when you've composed yourself. In other words, suppress all visible emotion before you're allowed to be part of the family again. Some punishment was public too, especially in school. A child who misbehaved might be forced to stand facing the wall with a dunce cap on. Or worse, wear a placard reading, "I am a liar," or "I am disobedient" in front of the entire classroom. It was humiliation as a lesson, because nothing reinforces good behaviour like psychologically scarring a 7-year-old. Here's a bizarre historical nugget. Some families subscribed to what was called the progressive whipping schedule. It involved regular beatings at set intervals, regardless of behaviour. Mondays and Thursdays, for instance. The idea was that regular discipline prevented spontaneous rebellion, like flossing your conscience. Sounds made up, but it's not. Of course, not everyone agreed with this parenting style, even at the time. A few notable dissenters, mostly poets, some early educators, and more than a few traumatised children who grew into bitter adults, argued that fear is not the same thing as respect. That punishing a child into submission might produce a polite exterior, but it kills curiosity, and joy, and trust. These ideas were, however, considered radical, sentimental, weak. The Victorian model prized order above all, and if the act meant a few bruises, well, so be it. One particularly loud debate happened in the 1870s, after a series of public scandals involving child abuse cases in respectable homes. Newspapers ran horrifying accounts of children beaten to death, locked in basements or starved as punishment. This sparked outrage, of course, but also confusion. Where was the line between discipline and cruelty? That question hung in the air, never fully answered. Still kind of is. So where does that leave you tonight, standing in the corner of the nursery, sore and trying not to sniffle too loudly? It leaves you learning a lesson, yes, but not the one they think. You're not absorbing morality. You're absorbing caution, secrecy, self-editing. You're learning to calculate every word, every movement, every expression. To weigh the cost of being visible. That's not discipline, that's survival. And the really twisted part? If you show signs of being too obedient, too quiet, too emotionally flat, they might pat themselves on the back for raising you well. Congratulations, you've been sculpted into a little statue of propriety. Try not to breathe too loudly. But don't worry, tomorrow we'll look at how Victorian families dealt with your basic needs, like feeding you, and how even that could get weird fast. Morning again, the light is grey and so is your porridge. It's lumpy, lukewarm, and watching you with the quiet suspicion of something that may or may not have once been food. Breakfast is not about enjoyment. This is Victorian England. It's about fuel, manners and hierarchy. You're expected to sit up straight, chew quietly, and consume whatever is placed in front of you with no complaints, even if it smells like boiled despair. Now, let's talk about how you get that food, specifically if you're an infant, because if you're born into a well-to-do family, there's a solid chance you're not even fed by your own mother. That job gets outsourced, often before you can form your first memory. Enter the wet nurse. The wet nurse economy is one of the stranger and more quietly disturbing chapters of Victorian parenting. For those unfamiliar, a wet nurse is a woman, typically working class or impoverished, hired to breastfeed another woman's baby. That's it. That's the job. Your body becomes a biological vending machine for someone else's child. And not just one child. Some wet nurses fed multiple babies in rotation. It's intimate, essential, and deeply transactional. For wealthier mothers, breastfeeding was seen as distasteful, inconvenient, and vaguely animalistic. It took time. It interfered with social calendars. It reshaped the body in unflattering ways. Worst of all, it connected a mother to her child on a level that might lead to dangerous things, like emotional attachment. That was a luxury for the poor. If you're the child in this equation, your first meals come not from the arms of your mother, but from a stranger hired to meet quotas. You're handed off like a package, fed, burped, maybe rocked for a moment, then passed back to the nursery staff. Your real mother might poke her head in once a day, maybe, and if she does, she's probably there to critique your posture or ask if your ears are growing unevenly. Now imagine you're the wet nurse. You've just had your own baby, because that's a requirement obviously, but instead of staying with them, you're sent to live in a wealthier household and feed their child instead. Your own child is often left behind, possibly with family, possibly not. Infant mortality for wet nurses' babies was heartbreakingly high, because their mothers weren't there to care for them. But hey, you've got a job now, a steady pay, a place to sleep, and someone else's silk-draped baby chewing on your nipple at 3 a.m. Some wet nurses were treated kindly. Most weren't. They were kept out of sight, sometimes even referred to by number or job title instead of name. They lived in cramped quarters near the nursery and were constantly monitored. Your milk supply? Charted and judged. If you didn't produce enough, you were fired. If your milk was considered too thin, replat. And if your own emotions started to show, maybe you cried about your child back home or asked for a day off, you were scolded for sentimentality. You were supposed to be professional, efficient and invisible. In poorer homes, of course, mothers often had no choice but to breastfeed themselves, assuming they could. But even then, Victorian attitudes around nursing were tangled in shame and superstition. Some women were told that nursing during certain times of the month would sour the milk. Others were warned not to eat too much cabbage or onions, lest it taint the baby. There were pamphlets, so many pamphlets, about how to produce more milk, how to avoid spoiling the child with too much holding, how to ensure your milk was morally upright. Because apparently milk could carry sin now. Oh, and don't think you're safe with the invention of the bottle. Early baby bottles were glass tubed with rubber hoses, often referred to as murder bottles by modern historians. Why? Because they were impossible to clean. Milk residue built up, bacteria multiplied, and the infant mortality rate for bottle-fed babies skyrocketed. But hey, it was convenient, and convenience was king. There were also elaborate formulas, often involving things like diluted cow's milk, sugar, arrowroot, and sometimes just for kicks, opium. Yes, many Victorian formulas included small doses of opiates to help the baby sleep, or stay quiet, or just chill out forever. There were popular products like Godfrey's Cordial and Mother's Friend marketed with delicate lettering and floral labels, concealing the fact that they were drugging infants into docile little lumps. If the baby stopped crying, the product was working. Never mind if they also stopped waking up. Here's your fringe fact for tonight. Some mothers used beer. Small beer, technically, a weak brew with low alcohol content. It was believed to calm the child and aid digestion. Imagine you're 6 months old, it's 1852, and you're already halfway to a pint. Cheers. And what if the baby didn't thrive? Well, the blame almost never landed on the system. It went straight to the mother, or the wet nurse. Inadequate milk, they'd say. Neglect. Failure to thrive. No one pointed fingers at the fact that the bottle was full of spoiled cream and lordness. The idea that children needed responsive care, consistent love, and actual nutrition was still decades away from becoming mainstream. To be fair, barely fair, there were some early medical voices raising concerns. Paediatricians and women's health advocates, usually women themselves, began writing about the dangers of artificial feeding and the emotional cost of separating mothers from infants. But these were whispered warnings against a booming chorus of status quo. Parenting was about appearance and discipline, not bonding or instincts. So here you are, just a few weeks old, wrapped in lace, propped in a wicker bassinet being passed from hand to hand like a china doll with too many caretakers. You're fed by someone who misses her own child. You're monitored by staff trained in obedience, not affection. And you grow in a world that measures your health in ounces, posture, and silence, not in cuddles or eye contact. But don't worry, if you're lucky, they'll start potty training you next month. And that's where the real fun begins. It's not even your first birthday, and already your career as a tiny civil servant has begun. Your new job? Control your bladder like a gentleman, or a lady, but definitely not like a baby. Because in the Victorian era, potty training didn't wait for developmental milestones or signs of readiness. It didn't involve stickers, charts, storybooks, or cheerful jingles. It involved bowls, threats, cold floors, and shame. Mostly shame. You're expected to master your body with the precision of a postal clerk before you can even form full sentences. Here's how it usually starts. The moment you're able to sit up, you're sat down on a ceramic pot or tin chamber. It's cold, it's draughty, and it's usually placed in the corner of the nursery where everyone can see you, including the nanny who has a stopwatch in her head and no interest in your feelings. It's not about when you feel ready. It's about schedule and discipline. Everything is schedule and discipline. If you produce results, praise is minimal. A nod, maybe a dry well done before you're scooped up and rewrapped in layers of linen and wool. If you don't, the look, the sigh, maybe even a slap on the leg. Yes, babies got those too. Some nurses use cold water as a deterrent, pouring it into the pot after failure to remind the child what they're supposed to do. And if you had an accident, that's not a normal stage of development. That's a personal failure, a moral failure. Some caregivers would hold your face near the mess, scold you in low, disappointed tones, and then leave you in soiled clothes just long enough for the lesson to sink in. Let's take a moment to appreciate the tools of the trade. Chamber pots weren't cute little plastic seats with cartoon stickers. They were metal or porcelain, hard-edged and echoing. Imagine sitting on that before you've even mastered balance. And then there was the Go Cup, a device for boys that supposedly made things easier, though in practice it mostly caused spills and screaming. Oh, and remember, diapers as we know them didn't exist. Babies were swaddled in cloth that had to be boiled after accidents. So cleanliness wasn't just about your dignity, it was about everyone's laundry workload. Messes weren't tolerated. They were seen as offensive violations of household order. Now, to be fair, some families, especially in rural areas, didn't have the time or resources to start potty instruction so early. But in middle and upper class homes, the pressure to produce a perfectly trained child by age 1 was intense. It was a sign of refinement, of status, of control. A baby who could sit still, eat quietly and use the chamber pot by 12 months was a trophy. Your bodily functions were part of your resume. There was even a pseudoscientific belief that early potty training built character. That mastering the bowels led to mastering the soul. Psychologists today would have a field day with that logic, and some actually did. In the 20th century, Freudian theorists would later look back at Victorian toilet training and go, "Ah yes, that explains so much." Fixation, control issues, repression, the whole package, or bowel. But not everyone agreed, even back then. A few fringe educators started whispering about child-led readiness, that children should be allowed to wait until their bodies told them when to go. They were mostly laughed out of the drawing room, accused of being too lenient, too soft. The general belief remained, babies could be trained like animals. If only you were firm enough. And yes, Victorian dog training manuals were suspiciously similar to baby training manuals. Sit, stay, be silent, control your urges. Good boy. Let's not forget the religious angle. In many households, controlling one's body was seen as a spiritual discipline. Cleanliness and modesty were divine virtues, and bodily functions, especially messy, uncontrolled ones, were viewed as almost sinful. A child who soiled themselves in church wasn't just embarrassing the family, they were offending God. That's quite the burden for a toddler. One particularly grim account from a governess's diary describes how a 2-year-old was made to sit on the training pot every hour, on the hour, from dawn until bedtime. If they didn't produce, they were not allowed to nap or eat. The goal was habit through routine. The result was a child who flinched every time they were led near the corner of the room where the pot sat. So yes, trauma, but neat trauma. Even once you were deemed trained, the scrutiny didn't stop. Children were frequently checked for signs of accidents, especially during the night. Some nurses performed nightly inspections, even waking children mid-sleep to march them bleary-eyed to the chamber pot. No privacy, no mercy, just cold floors and colder stairs. It also wasn't uncommon for children to be punished for lying about having an accident. Imagine the logic. Your body does something you're not yet in control of, and when you instinctively hide the evidence, because you're terrified, you're labelled a deceiver. And deceivers are dealt with. Maybe you're denied supper. Maybe you're forced to kneel and pray for forgiveness. Maybe you're sent to bed in wet clothes to reflect on your sins. You're not quite 3 years old. A strange side effect of all this. Some children developed what we'd now call toilet anxiety, refusing to go, holding it until painful, hiding behind furniture, or going only in secret. But to the Victorian eye, that just meant you weren't broken in yet. Time for more structure, more shame. Let's zoom out a bit. What's really happening here? Victorian potty training wasn't about hygiene. It wasn't even about convenience. It was about control. About shaping behaviour through bodily discipline. If a child could control their nature, they could be trusted to obey greater laws. It was the first great test in a lifetime of conformity, and it worked, sort of. Many children did learn early, but at what cost? Beneath the polished exterior of those prim little boys and girls were hearts clenched just as tight as their tiny bladders. They learned to hide discomfort, avoid weakness, and suppress any need that might be deemed inconvenient. These were toddlers trained in fear before they were even tall enough to reach the doorknob. So tonight, as you lie in your small, drafty bed with the hard seam of your nightshirt digging into your side, you try not to move too much. You don't want to call attention. You certainly don't want to ask to use the pot. Better to hold it. Better to be quiet. Better to impress the adults with your self-control, and tomorrow you might get some fresh air, sort of. Assuming you don't fall out the window, the sun is barely up, but already you're being bundled into layers, stockings, undershirts, a stiff jacket, shoes that haven't been properly broken in air because you're expected to grow into them. Today is your airing out, also known as the daily constitutional, also known as let's make the children walk in circles around the garden and pretend it's for their health. But don't get too excited. This isn't a romp through nature. This is exercise on a leash. You are walked like a dog, but with more lectures about posture. Unless, of course, you're a baby, because if you're under 2 years old in Victorian London, there's a good chance your fresh air comes with a slight vertical challenge. You're hanging out a window. Literally. Let's talk about baby cages. That's right. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some urban families, especially those crammed into tight city apartments, used metal-framed wire mesh cages that they bolted to the outside of upper-story windows to give babies their dose of healthy outdoor air. Think fire escape meets birdcage, but with a baby inside, hanging several stories above cobblestone streets, soot, and the general thrum of horse manure. From the outside, these window cages looked like air conditioners with legs. They were lined with cushions, maybe a blanket, and just enough space for the baby to lie down or sit up. A small mesh roof kept the child from climbing or falling out, so thoughtful, while the open sides allowed for that ever-so-important good air, which Victorians believed was the secret to strong lungs and good morals. It's kind of sweet if you ignore the fatal drop just inches away. Now, these cages weren't exactly mass-produced right away. They started as custom-made curiosities, something an eccentric parent might commission from a local blacksmith. But by the early 20th century, they were commercially available. One 1908 advertisement in a parenting magazine promoted them as ideal for fresh air training, with the added benefit of freeing the mother's hands for chores. Nothing says peace of mind like hanging your child over traffic while you tidy up the parlour. To be fair, the logic, Victorian logic, wasn't entirely irrational. Air quality inside was often worse than outside. Homes were poorly ventilated, heated by coal fires, and sealed against drafts. It was like living inside a smokestack. Doctors had started to notice that children who spent more time outdoors were healthier. So the solution? Strap the baby to the outside of the building. Makes sense, right? Still, not everyone was sold. Some neighbours reported families to the police claiming child endangerment. Authorities would knock on doors, peer suspiciously at the dangling cages, and then, more often than not, shrug. As long as the baby wasn't currently falling, it wasn't technically illegal. Plus, the cages were often bolted into masonry with iron supports, giving them an air of engineering legitimacy. People trust bolts, but not everyone had cages. Most children were marched into gardens or city parks for their daily walk. Emphasis on marched. This wasn't playtime, it was posture time. You had to walk upright, hands behind your back or gently folded in front. No slouching, no dawdling, no skipping. If you fell or tripped, you were not picked up. You were expected to rise, brush yourself off, and apologise to your nanny for being clumsy in public. Victorians loved a self-aware injury. Even toddlers were subject to this rigid routine. Tiny children, barely able to walk without falling into hedges, were dressed in stiff wool and patent leather, and paraded through the park like furniture with legs. If you were upper class, a nursemaid pushed you in a heavy pram the size of a mail cart. These prams were less about comfort and more about status. They were cumbersome, ornate, and impossible to steer. Think of them as baby carriages built for maximum visibility, minimum practicality. And here's where it gets strange. The children weren't supposed to enjoy these outings. At least not outwardly. The point was fresh air, yes, but also discipline, exposure to society and demonstration of good breeding. You were being presented to the world, smiling too much, running off, playing in the mud. That wasn't cute. That was undignified. Some nursemaids kept vinegar-soaked cloths in their pockets, not for cleaning, but for dabbing on children's lips if they smiled too freely. Joy apparently needed a little souring. Also, you weren't allowed to talk to strangers, or worse, other children from lower classes. Playgrounds didn't really exist yet, but some public parks had designated areas for children, and even then, they were informally segregated by class. You could wave, maybe, but speaking? Dangerous. Who knows what working-class ideas might enter your delicate little brain. That said, there were some quirky forms of outdoor fun. Boys, for example, might be allowed to play with hoops and sticks, which sounds charming, until you realise how much emphasis was placed on doing it correctly. If your hoop wobbled or your stick technique was sloppy, you weren't praised for effort. You were criticised for lack of refinement. Girls might be given dolls to carry during walks, but not to play with. The doll was more like a prop, a signal that you were already being trained for motherhood, whether you liked it or not. Meanwhile, your nursemaid had her own rules. She was to remain upright, dignified, and alert. No sitting, no chatting, no distractions. Being a nursery maid in public was a job in performance. If the child acted up, she was punished. So naturally, keeping you in line became an Olympic sport of quiet threats and stealthy arm pinches. Some progressive families did things differently. A few brave souls, writers, artists, even a couple of the rogue doctors, encouraged their children to explore freely, get dirty, and interact with nature. But this was fringe thinking, whispered behind closed doors and scorned in the press. Let a child touch a frog, might as well let them read French novels and wear sandals. Madness. All this, of course, was driven by the Victorian obsession with health, an obsession both modern and hilariously misguided. People believed in miasmas, in bad air carrying disease through invisible vapour. So good air, fresh air, was the antidote. Babies were aired like bedsheets. Children were marched like soldiers. And if you caught a cold, well, maybe you weren't aired enough. So here you are, being walked through the park with your head held high and your knees aching from stiff socks. You want to chase a bird or throw a pebble into the pond, but no, you're told to observe, not interact. Smile politely if addressed. Hold your posture. Look like someone who was born to inherit land. Back home, the baby in the cage outside the window is being reeled in, freshly aired, slightly cold, and hopefully not dropped. The nursemaid wipes their nose, checks their pulse with a practiced hand, and sets them back in the cradle for another dose of obedient silence. Tomorrow we'll take a closer look at what happens to those kids no one wanted to bring back inside. It's evening now. The fire has burned down low, the nursery is dim, and outside the gas lamps flicker along the street. You've made it through another day of enforced civility, barely brushing the edge of a laugh when your younger sibling sneezed into their bowl of peas. It was heroic restraint, honestly. But while you're being buttoned into yet another nightgown that smells vaguely of lye and lavender, your nursemaid drops a chilling remainder. Tomorrow we start your training. Your stomach knots. You already did training. Walking properly, speaking only when spoken to, sitting without wriggling. What more could there be? You forgot the crown jewel of Victorian control, nighttime potty discipline? Or as we'll call it tonight, the sleep time siege. If you thought daytime toilet training was strict, nighttime was a horror story disguised as good parenting. Victorians were obsessed with regulating the body around the clock, and nighttime accidents were considered one of the greatest signs of a weak will. So if you had trouble with bedwetting, it wasn't viewed as a natural part of development. It was a personal and moral failure. You were undisciplined, weak, possibly even perverse. Yes, some medical literature of the time suggested that nighttime accidents were the result of unclean thoughts. You're 6. So what did the solution look like? For starters, you might be roused several times a night to sit on the pot, not because you asked, just in case. The nursemaid or your mother, or sometimes a hired night nurse, would come in with the grim determination of someone about to scrub a floor, light the candle, yank off your blanket and command, "Up." No gentle words, no warm hugs, just you, half asleep, trembling on cold floorboards, perched over a freezing porcelain bowl, eyes half shut, trying to remember where you are. If you didn't produce anything, well, then your body was clearly trying to rebel. You were instructed to try harder. Sometimes you'd be kept there for minutes, 10 minutes, 15, more, until someone was satisfied you weren't holding back. Try doing that while shivering and being stared at like a suspect under interrogation. Still, that was the mild version. For the more stubborn cases, or more anxious parents, things escalated quickly. Some households introduced wet sheets punishment. If you wet the bed, your sheets were left damp, and you were required to sleep in them as a deterrent. That's right. No changing, no comfort, just wet, freezing linens and the smell of shame. Others would parade the soiled bedding through the house as a public reminder. This is what failure looks like. Sometimes older siblings were instructed to help with the cleaning, further spreading the humiliation. Now, brace yourself, because it gets worse. Enter the bladder alarm, not an electric device. Of course, this was the 1800s, but there were mechanical contraptions that allegedly detected moisture and rang a bell. And then there were improvised methods. Bells sewn into nightshirts that would jingle if you moved suspiciously. Your movements were monitored. Any sign of stirring in the night could lead to a lamp being lit and an adult checking your sheets. Sleep? Optional. Dryness? Mandatory. And what if none of that worked? What if, despite the stress, the shame, the freezing floors and bells and inspections, you still had accidents? Well, then it must be psychological, or spiritual. So begins a new phase, moral purification. This could take many forms. Long talks about temptation, instructions not to drink anything after midday, encouragements to pray each night that your body behaves. One child, according to a mother's letter from the 1860s, was required to kneel and recite 10 psalms after every wet night. To cleanse the soul through repetition, she wrote. The soul apparently resided in the bladder. Some families turned to remedies. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a playground of questionable substances. Children were given tinctures made from belladonna, a literal poison, to calm bladder spasms. Others took syrupy mixes containing opium to suppress nighttime urination, which incidentally also suppressed breathing, consciousness, and sometimes life itself. If it kept you dry, though, they called it progress. Let's pause for a fringe fact. There was a short-lived craze for urine analysis among obsessive parents. Small at-home kits were sold so you could test your child's urine for signs of excess sugar, bile, or nervous instability. This wasn't science so much as paranoia dressed up in white gloves, but it allowed parents to blame biology rather than their methods, or at least feel better about punishing their kid. There were dissenters. A few early psychologists, especially on the continent, argued that bedwetting was a sign of anxiety, not laziness. That children under stress, especially those experiencing fear or emotional neglect, were more likely to wet the bed, but these ideas didn't reach mainstream parenting for decades. Until then, nighttime accidents remained taboo, and the treatment was more about behavioural enforcement than the compassion. So tonight, after your long day of Victorian virtue, you lie in bed, still silent and terrified of your own kidneys. The sheets are crisp. The mattress is horsehair and itchy. Somewhere across the room, the nursemaid sits silently in a rocker, knitting and watching. The candle burns low. You've been forbidden to drink since noon, but still your stomach aches with thirst. You close your eyes. You will your body to stay motionless. You try to sleep without moving too much, for fear the bed creaks will be mistaken for suspicious activity. And it's not just about punishment. You don't want to disappoint. You want to be good. You want to be good. You want the nursemaid to nod in the morning. You want your mother to call you proper. You want the day to begin with breakfast and not the rustle of wet sheets and disappointed sighs. You want to be perfect, or at least dry. But children are children, and bodies are wild things. They grow when they shouldn't, ache without reason, and sometimes, just sometimes, forget the rules. So sleep comes slowly, with shallow breaths and clenched legs, and somewhere in your dreams you're standing on cold stone, holding a chamber pot under the moon. Tomorrow, we'll talk about what happens when your family decides they're just done with you altogether. The door closes softly behind you. You've been walked into a room you don't recognise by someone you don't know, and before you can ask any questions, they're already halfway down the stairs. Your small travel bag is sitting near your feet, stuffed with a few spare socks, a crusty old brush, and one formal outfit that doesn't fit anymore. No goodbye hug, no lingering glance, no explanation, just, "You'll be a credit to us if you mind your manners," and then they're gone. You're 7 years old, and as far as your family is concerned, you don't live there anymore. This is not the tragic tale of an orphan. You weren't abandoned on a doorstep or discovered in a basket in the rain. No, this is something far more common and somehow more chilling. You've been sent away on purpose while your parents still live in the same city, possibly even the same street. Because in the Victorian era, children were often removed from their families for one simple reason: convenience. Maybe your family fell on hard times. Maybe you were a difficult child, too emotional, too loud, too sensitive to correction. Or maybe you were just born a spare. In households with more children than the budget could stomach or more than the staff could wrangle, parents sometimes made the pragmatic decision to place a child elsewhere. An orphanage, a training school, a charity home, somewhere they wouldn't have to deal with your inconvenient presence, but could still tell dinner guests, yes, he's being educated in a fine institution. Let's look at some of these institutions. First up, the foundling hospitals. Despite the name, these weren't hospitals in the medical sense. They were more like child storage facilities, usually run by religious organisations, where children were raised en masse with just enough resources to survive, but not enough to thrive. Staffed by overworked matrons and undertrained assistants, the focus was on discipline, obedience, and religious instruction. Personal attention was rare, affection even rarer. In theory, these places were meant for orphans, but in practice many parents surrendered their children voluntarily. Sometimes it was temporary, just until money improved. Other times it was a permanent handoff. One less mouth to feed, one less bed to heat. Some children were even dropped off anonymously, no names, no history. Just a note pinned to their shirt saying something like, "Please, raise him well." And let's not pretend these were always acts of desperation. In more comfortable families, sending a child away could be about image. A child who stuttered, a child with a disability, a child who wet the bed too often. These were embarrassments, and families who cared deeply about social standing often preferred to sweep such details quietly out of sight. A polite donation to a local home and poof, problem solved. But what were these homes really like? Imagine a long, cold room lined with metal-framed beds, rough wool blankets, no decorations, no toys. Just a water basin at the end of the bed and a drawer containing one extra shirt. The day begins at 5 a.m. with a bell loud enough to startle your bones. You line up for a wash, you dress in uniform, you eat something grey and flavourless, and then you're marched off for lessons that mostly involve memorising Bible verses and reciting rules. And if you break the rules, accidentally talk during prayer, lose your place in the reading, you're punished. Harshly. These places weren't built to raise happy children. They were built to raise manageable ones. Future servants, future factory workers, future cannon fodder. Some homes trained girls in laundry, cooking, and mending. Boys learned boot polishing, wood cutting, or, if they were lucky, basic reading and arithmetic. If you showed a spark of curiosity or rebellion, it was quickly extinguished. Individuality wasn't useful here. One fringe tale that lingers in dusty archives is the story of a boy placed in an orphanage in Birmingham whose family lived just 2 streets away. His older brother passed him on the road every morning on the way to work, but they were forbidden to speak. Why? Because contact with family could disrupt the emotional progress of the child. In other words, it was better for him to think he had been truly abandoned, even though he hadn't. That was considered more orderly. And what about children placed as indentured wards? That's right. Some kids weren't just placed in homes, they were contracted out. Victorian England had a deeply uncomfortable relationship with child labour, we'll dig into that soon, and some families would essentially loan their children to tradespeople or farms for long-term apprenticeships. In theory, these arrangements were mutually beneficial. The child learned a trade, the host got help. The parents got one less dependent. But often it was a thinly veiled form of abandonment. Once you were handed over, there was no guarantee of safety, no visits, no regular check-ins. If you were treated poorly, and many were, there was almost no recourse. You were property in all but name, and at the end of the contract, Maybe they let you go, maybe they didn't. Maybe you didn't survive long enough to find out. This is the part of Victorian parenting that rarely makes it into costume dramas. The elegant homes and stiff manners look picturesque from the outside, but behind the lace curtains was a brutal economy of disposability. Children weren't seen as emotionally valuable. They were seen as morally fragile and logistically burdensome. And in a society where reputation trumped relationship, many parents chose distance over connection, politeness over presence. Of course, not everyone followed this model. There were parents, mothers especially, who resisted, who begged for more time, more resources, more mercy. But they were often overruled by husbands, grandmothers, ministers, or societal expectations. A child who didn't fit had to be hidden, a problem solved with formality and shame. So tonight you lie in a strange bed in a strange building. The mattress is thinner and the silence heavier. There's no one to tuck you in, no familiar creak of your old floorboards, no faint scent of the family hearth. Just rows of breathing, coughing, sighing children. Some older, some younger, all somewhere between forgotten and forbidden. Tomorrow morning you'll wake before the sun and scrub your own clothes in a basin. You'll line up for breakfast. You'll answer to a name that may not even be yours. And you'll start learning how to disappear into the system. Because in the Victorian world, love is conditional. And children are lucky to be tolerated at all. It's dawn and the floor beneath your feet is cold stone. You're not quite sure if you're still dreaming, or if this grey, echoing hallway is your new reality. Someone is ringing a bell again. Victorians loved bells. And the other children around you are already dressed, already moving, already quiet. You try to keep up. Today's schedule includes cleaning, mending, prayer, and a half-hour of reading, aloud from a book with brittle pages. But first, a job. You've been assigned to sweep, not the hallway, not your own room. No, you'll be sweeping the chimneys. Let's take a long, sooty breath and talk about what might be the most infamous and horrifying role ever assigned to a Victorian child. The chimney sweep boy or girl. Let's not pretend girls were spared, but most often it was boys between the ages of 5 and 10, tiny, bony, expendable. The perfect size for crawling up a narrow flue barely wider than a dinner plate. If you can squeeze up it, you can clean it, and if you can't, well, let's hope the family downstairs wasn't too attached to their Christmas plans. You've probably seen the romanticised version. Chimney sweeps in movies, singing and dancing with smudged cheeks and Cockney accents, joyfully tossing soot into the air like confetti. That is not what was happening. Victorian chimney sweeping was brutal and dangerous, and almost always deadly in the long term. The real story? Far grimmer. Less Mary Poppins, more industrial horror with bonus lung disease. Let's start at the top, literally. Chimneys in the Victorian era weren't just straight tubes. Oh no, they were architectural nightmares. Narrow shafts, tight bends, blind corners. Some flues were less than 9 inches wide. These chimneys twisted through houses like angry snakes, and so they had to be cleaned constantly because coal soot was sticky and flammable. Chimney fires were common, and property damage was always bad for business. So the solution? Children. Small, flexible, desperate children. You, for example. You're given a burlap sack to collect soot, a brush and a scraper. You're told to remove your outer clothes to avoid getting stuck. Sometimes you're completely naked because that means less friction. At the bottom of the chimney, a master sweep stands with a rod or stick, not for cleaning but to jab you if you slow down or panic. He doesn't yell, he doesn't need to. Pain is a more effective motivator. Up you go, arms and legs splayed, bracing against black walls. You start to crawl, you hold your breath, you blink soot out of your eyes, your fingers bleed from the brick. If you get stuck, which happens more than anyone wants to admit, you call down. If you don't, they assume you're fine, or they assume you've passed out. Either way, someone lights a small fire at the bottom to encourage movement. Yes, that was a real technique. The chimney master lights straw or paper and lets the smoke climb. The child inside panics, kicks, claws, and if they're lucky, makes it to the top coughing and gasping. If they're not lucky, well, there's a reason some older chimneys have been discovered with small human bones still inside. And this wasn't happening in slums or secret corners. This was standard practice. In every city, townhouses, manors, bakeries, inns, every building with a hearth needed a clean chimney. And children were the cheapest, easiest labour to do the job. There were laws eventually. Parliament passed the Chimney Sweepers Act in 1788, which supposedly banned the use of children under 8, then another in 1834 raising the age to 14. But enforcement was laughable. Wealthy homeowners didn't ask questions, chimney masters forged documents, children lied about their ages, or didn't know them to begin with. It wasn't until 1875, nearly a century later, that child chimney sweeping was finally actually outlawed with enforceable teeth. By then, thousands of children had suffered, and many had died. Some of the physical effects were immediate: crushed ribs, fractured limbs, soot burns, and severe eye infections. But the long-term consequences were even more insidious. There was even a disease named after them: chimney sweep's carcinoma, one of the earliest known occupational cancers caused by prolonged exposure to soot and ash. Children who survived to adulthood often died young from respiratory illness or aggressive skin cancer, especially in the groin area, where soot settled into the folds of skin during climbs. Now you might ask, why did children agree to this? Most didn't. Many were orphans or wards of the state handed over to chimney masters through apprenticeship contracts, which were basically legal child leasing agreements. Some were kidnapped, yes, kidnapped, grabbed off the street or purchased from desperate parents. There were even broadsheets warning citizens to keep watch over small children lest they fall into the soot trade. And yet here and there, a sweep boy became a local legend. Some survived, grew up, and became chimney masters themselves. A few even escaped and wrote memoirs, grim, angry documents that eventually helped fuel reform. But those were the exceptions. For most, it was a short, miserable career that ended in coughing blood and being buried in a pauper's grave. Let's not ignore the psychological effects. Crawling through dark, suffocating tunnels with the threat of burning beneath you doesn't just scar the body. It warps the mind. Some children developed chronic anxiety, night terrors, an intense fear of confinement that lasted their whole lives. But in Victorian society, these weren't considered problems. They were invisible consequences. You did your job, you got your crust of bread, and if you had nightmares, that was your private burden. One darkly fascinating fringe practice. Some wealthy families would have portraits painted of their sweep boys, covered in soot, barefoot, eyes hollow, displayed like exotic pets, evidence of both charity and order. Look how well we civilize even the lowest of the low. The image was less about the boy and more about the family's benevolence. Victorian PR was brutal, and just to add a final drop of horror, there were even nursery rhymes about sweep boys. Sing-song poems meant to entertain toddlers while romanticising one of the deadliest jobs a child could have. When I was a little boy, I lived by myself. You might hear as a baby claps along and a sweep boy collapses in the street outside. So tonight, as you lie on a straw mattress in a room that still smells faintly of coal smoke, you cough into your sleeve. Your elbows are scraped. Your knees are raw. Your nails are black with ash. And tomorrow you'll be doing it again, because the flue at the baker's shop is due for cleaning, and you're the only one small enough to climb it. But if you're lucky, maybe one day your voice will be heard. Maybe a lawmaker will read your story. Maybe you'll survive long enough to be the last boy forced to crawl through fire for someone else's warmth. And maybe, just maybe, no child after you will have to live with soot in their lungs and fear in their bones. Your fingers are still sore from yesterday, and your joints feel older than they should. You shuffle into line behind a dozen other children, all dressed in hand-me-downs that seem to weigh more than you do. The morning light leaks through dusty windows, and the scent of boiled oats and damp wool fills your nose. There's no talk, no laughter, just the creak of wooden floorboards and the occasional cough. You're 7, maybe 8, and this is your new normal. You horrible work. Because in the Victorian world, childhood isn't a protected phase of life, it's a labour pool. Let's talk about child labour, not the general idea, but the very specific, everyday grind of what it meant to be a working child in a society that didn't just permit it, it relied on it. You weren't just a burden to feed or a pupil to educate. You were a productive unit, an extra pair of hands, a tiny cog in a very big soot-covered machine. And it started early, sometimes shockingly early. You could be put to work as young as 5, especially in industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, or parts of East London. If you were lucky, or rather less unlucky, you got simple tasks: threading needles in a garment shop, picking stones out of coal, or winding spools in a textile mill. If you were unlucky, welcome to the mines. Let's take a breath and step down into the darkness. The coal mines of Victorian England weren't just cramped, they were terrifying. Imagine crawling through low, damp tunnels, your candle flickering in the stale air, dragging a heavy cart of coal behind you. You might be down there for 12 hours a day. You might be 8, maybe 7. There are accounts of children who were 3 years old when they were first brought underground, as trappers. They had one job: sit alone in the dark, open and close ventilation doors when miners came through. No moving, no noise, just a little child in the black hour after hour, with nothing but a flickering oil lamp and the sound of pickaxes echoing like thunder around them. Of course, not all children worked in mines. Some worked in factories, textiles especially. These factories were loud, hot, and filled with machines that didn't care how small your hands were or how curious you felt that day. Children were often tasked with cleaning and maintenance while the machines were running. Tiny fingers fit into tight spaces. You just had to time it right. If you didn't, well, there's a reason Victorian factory records include casualty logs. Then there were the match factories, which mostly employed girls, many of them pre-teens. Working conditions involved phosphorus fumes so toxic that it rotted jawbones. That's not poetic exaggeration. It literally caused a condition known as phossy jaw, where the flesh around the jaw would decay, leaving open wounds and exposed bone. It smelled like death, and yet it paid. Not much, but something. Enough to bring home a crust of bread. And don't forget the street workers. These were children not tied to one location, but still absolutely working for survival. Shoeshine boys, flower girls, newspaper sellers, mudlarks who scoured the Thames for scraps of metal or coal, crossing sweepers who cleared paths through manure for wealthy pedestrians, all of them children. Some as young as 4 or 5, no supervisors, no safety. Just London fog, filth, and a few pennies if the day went well. A quirky fringe job? Rat catching? Yes, really. Some kids were hired to wrangle rats in markets, warehouses, and even fancy households. It was dirty, dangerous, and weirdly respected. There was even an informal rat-catching league among boys who would compare catches like Pokemon cards. One famous boy named Jack Black, yes, seriously, became Queen Victoria's personal rat catcher. He also bred fancy rats for sale as pets, because why not? Now, you might be wondering, where were the adults while all this was happening? Working, usually, or too poor to say no to a little extra income from their kids. Victorian society believed in learning through labour. The earlier a child started work, the more prepared they'd be for adulthood. School was optional. Earning your keep, that was sacred. There were schools, of course. Charity schools, church schools, ragged schools for the very poor. But attendance was patchy at best, and most children had to work around the school schedule, if their parents even let them go. Education didn't put food on the table. Factory shifts did. And while there were laws introduced to regulate child labour, like the Factory Act starting in 1833, enforcement was weak. Inspectors were few and underpaid, and many factories operated in the shadows. Children lied about their age, employers looked the other way, and even when fines were issued, they were tiny. A child's life was cheaper than a broken loom. And yes, of course there were reformers. People like Lord Shaftesbury who campaigned against child labour and pushed for what are better working conditions. He published horrifying testimonies from working children that shocked the public. One girl said she hadn't seen the sun in 3 months. One boy described pulling coal carts with a strap across his forehead like a mule. These stories stirred outrage, but change was slow because every reform threatened someone's profit margin. Let's not forget the emotional toll. Childhood labour wasn't just physically exhausting, it robbed you of your sense of self. Play, creativity, learning, those weren't rights, they were indulgences. You didn't dream of what you'd be when you grew up, you were already grown. A smaller version maybe, but carrying burdens you couldn't name. And if you complained, you were told to be grateful. Work kept you fed, or work kept you off the streets. Work made you moral. So tonight, as you lay your tired body down on a wooden cot with a scratchy wool blanket, your hands still ache. You think of the loom, the press, the rats, the coal, the cold river mud. You're not even 10, but your muscles are hard, your eyes are weary, and your back will never quite straighten the way it should. And tomorrow, another shift, another scrape, another day of work before the sun even rises, because in Victorian England, the only thing more dangerous than a lazy child was one who had time to think. It's barely morning and you've already been yelled at for tracking coal dust into the kitchen. You haven't even eaten yet. Not that there's much waiting for you, just a crust of bread, a splash of watery tea, and another long day where the best case scenario is only mildly injured. Your eyes sting from yesterday's work, your back is a knot of muscle and bruises, and as you glance up at the chimney, you're deeply aware that some children don't even get to feel this tired. Because some didn't come home at all. Today you're going to learn about one of the most dangerous jobs a child could have in Victorian England. The chimney sweep's spiritual cousin, the climbing boys, pit kids, and little factory runners who lived in a world where survival was optional. They worked alongside death like it was just another co-worker, and sometimes they didn't make it back. Let's talk about the children who vanished. Start with the climbing boys who, yes, we covered is, but they weren't the only ones who disappeared into chimneys and never came out. Some flues were twisted so tightly that a child could get stuck, wedged inside like a cork in a bottle. In some cases, the soot acted like glue. Breathing became impossible. If no one noticed, or worse, if no one cared, the child might suffocate, still clutching their brush or scraping rod. Sometimes another sweep would be sent in after them. If they were lucky, they could pull the stuck boy free. If not, well, then both were left for the firemen. It happened often enough that chimney sweeps carried long iron hooks, not just for cleaning but for retrieval. But it wasn't just the chimneys. Children died in factories almost daily, crushed beneath gears, caught in spinning jennies. Some slipped and fell between floorboards, landing in basements that no one visited for hours. If they cried out, maybe someone heard. If not, they were found after dark, cold and broken when the machines were finally powered down. And what did the factory owner say? Careless? Untrained? An unfortunate accident. A new child would be hired the next day, no questions asked. Then there were the match girls, lighting tiny fires in toxic rooms for pennies. The phosphorus they handled glowed faintly in the dark. A haunting green shimmer they probably found magical the first few times, until their teeth started to ache, then rot, then fall out. Phossy jaw came next. The face would swell, the skin would peel, and eventually bone would be exposed to the air. It smelled, it hurt, and it killed. Some girls died quietly. Others were sent away, fired for being unsightly or disturbing the morale of the younger workers. The irony was thick. They were punished for the injuries caused by the very job they were told would build character. Let's take a turn toward the truly bleak. Ever heard of mudlarks? Children, usually orphans or runaways, who spent their days scavenging in the Thames. We're talking ankle-deep in sewage, glass and decaying fish, searching for scraps of coal, bits of rope, the occasional lost coin. The river wasn't just filthy, it was dangerous. Its current was unpredictable, its banks were slippery. And when the tides rose, they rose fast. Children drowned. Their bodies sometimes found days later, bloated and grey, tangled in debris, sometimes never found at all. And no, there were no rescue teams, no headlines. If a child went missing, there might be a quiet inquiry from a sibling or a fellow worker, but mostly, silence. Their absence was absorbed into the grey thrum of the city, like smoke in fog. Another little ghost added to London's collection. Then there were the sleep-ins, children who worked in shops or homes as assistants, or scullery boys and girls. Many slept in the same rooms they worked in, kitchens, storerooms, stairwells. If a fire broke out, no fire escape. If a shelf collapsed, no one to call for help. One tragic account describes a 9-year-old girl working in a bakery who suffocated when a stack of flour sacks collapsed on top of her while she slept. Her body wasn't discovered until midday because no one thought to look for her. She was always so quiet, the baker's wife reportedly said. Fringe fact break. In Victorian England, there were entire police protocols written not for finding missing children, but for disposing of unidentified ones. Yes, if a child was found dead and unclaimed, they were catalogued, logged and buried in common graves, sometimes with dozens of others. No headstone, no family name, just a short note in a worn black ledger. Male child approx. 7, found in Limehouse, presumed drowning. So many vanished, and so many were just accepted as losses, a necessary cost of the Empire's forward march. Some reformers pushed back, demanding accountability, safer conditions, real inspections. But for every pamphlet published, there were 10 factory owners arguing that children were more nimble, more obedient, and less expensive. The system was too profitable to change quickly. Let's talk numbers. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, it's estimated that nearly 1/3 of the workforce in textile factories were children under 15. That's hundreds of thousands of kids, many younger than 10, working full-time jobs 6 days a week. Accidents were so common that some factories kept crude stretchers near exits, not for rescue but for removal. Some even had replacement benches near machinery, where fresh children sat waiting for their turn. One goes down, the next steps in. And it wasn't just the work, it was the neglect. If you got sick, you weren't sent home. You were expected to push through if you cried, weakness if you collapsed, laziness. Death was often blamed on childhood frailty, as if the child simply couldn't withstand the noble strain of labour. No one considered that maybe, just maybe, kids weren't supposed to be lifting barrels or breathing in metal shavings for 12 hours a day. And then there were the foundlings, the ones dropped off at institutions like the Foundling Hospital in London. Some were placed as infants, some older. A few were reclaimed by parents who got back on their feet, but many were not. If they died young, the staff might write a letter. But often the grave was dug before anyone even responded. Life moved on, the orphanage was full, there was always another baby on the way. So tonight, as you drift off on your scratchy cot in a shared dormitory where the windows rattle and the air tastes faintly of copper, you stare at the ceiling and wonder, what happened to Joseph? He didn't come back from the mill last week. No one said anything. The foreman just pointed to you and said, "You're taking his spot." And you did, because you're still alive, still working, still here. But for how long? It's Sunday, your supposed day of rest. But let's not get too comfortable. You're not sprawled out with a book or skipping stones by the river or building forts from old crates. No, you're in your stiffest, most scratchy clothes, with buttons that dig into your ribs and shoes that feel like small wooden boxes. You're standing straight, eyes forward, waiting for the adults to finish talking so you can finally be allowed to play. But even that word means something very different in the Victorian world, because Victorian playtime wasn't a break, it was another lesson in survival. Let's start with toys. If you're lucky enough to have any, they're probably made of wood, metal, or, if you're from a wealthier family, porcelain and lead. Yes, lead. It made paint bright and cheap, and no one seemed too worried about the whole toxic exposure part. Children gnawed on painted doll heads, drank from pewter mugs and played with miniature tea sets made entirely of lead-glazed ceramic. The goal was to imitate adulthood, not to have fun. If you got sick, it was chalked up to weak constitution or summer fever. Spoiler. It was probably the toys slowly poisoning you. Boys had toy soldiers made of cast iron, sometimes sharpened around the edges from cheap moulding. Girls got dolls, of course, but not the plush, cuddly kind. Victorian dolls had glass eyes that never blinked, and stiff-painted faces that always looked like they had just witnessed a mild crime. Their bodies were made of sawdust and cloth, or porcelain so brittle it shattered if dropped from a modest height. Drop it. And you got to learn an important lesson about consequences. There was no such thing as just a toy. It was a moral exercise in responsibility. And if you had no toys, you improvised. Street kids played with whatever they could find, stones, rags, bones, games like Kick the Can or Knuckle Bones, which, yes, was originally played with actual animal knuckles. You might also collect bits of broken pottery, pretend they were coins, and trade them like currency. If you were lucky, someone might toss you a real penny. If you were really lucky, you didn't get beat up for having it. Games themselves were less about fun and more about character. Oranges and Lemons was a popular nursery rhyme, but if you've never listened to the lyrics closely, try it sometime. It ends with an ominous, "Here comes the chopper to chop off your head." Cheery, other games involved chants about plague, death, or debt. Red Rover often left children with bruises and twisted wrists. Jump rope could be played with actual rope pulled from shipping yards, sometimes still stiff with tar. Safety wasn't the point. Endurance was. If you were a girl, your play usually revolved around preparing for marriage. You weren't just playing house, you were rehearsing your eventual role. Doll houses mirrored actual Victorian homes, complete with tiny sculleries, parlours, and doll-sized servants. You'd pretend to manage the household, discipline the dolls, and cook pretend meals, all while sitting with perfect posture. A girl seen running or shouting was corrected, not because it was rude, but because it was unladylike. A girl had to learn restraint early. It was your duty to become small, polite and palatable. Boys had a slightly wider range, especially in the upper classes. You might be given a cricket bat or a hoop and stick, essentially a wooden circle you rolled along the ground with another stick. It required coordination and relentless patience. If the hoop veered into the street and got run over by a carriage, your fault. Learn from it. Crying was discouraged, even in toddlers. Physical pain was part of growing up. Emotional pain, that was private business. Then there were group activities, often arranged by adults for their moral value. Think, reciting poetry, marching in a line, or participating in parlour games that involved long, confusing rules, light shaming, and absolutely no running. Charades was acceptable, leapfrog too chaotic, tag, out of the question. Games had to be orderly, structured, controlled. A true Victorian game didn't make you laugh, it made you behave. Of course some children ignored the rules. There were rebels in every alley and attic. You might find a gang of street kids in East London, rolling marbles down a gutter and betting scraps of food. Or girls skipping rope until their shoes fell apart. Shouting rhymes about shopkeepers and teachers behind their backs. These kids made up their own games, carved tops out of broom handles, and drew chalk boards on alley walls to pretend they had classrooms. Play was a form of resistance. A way to be children, if only for 10 minutes before the next shift or chore. Let's not skip over injuries. Victorian playtime was a minefield of hazards. Metal toys rusted, dolls shattered, hoops flew into faces. Nobody wore helmets. Helmets weren't a thing. If you fell, you were expected to walk it off, or be scolded for clumsiness. One popular toy, called a whip and top, involved whipping a spinning wooden object until it fell over. And if your aim was off, well, hopefully your sibling can still see out of that eye. Here's your quirky historical fact. In wealthier homes, some boys had access to miniature gun sets, actual working guns, just scaled down for sport. There were even guides written for teaching marksmanship to boys under 10, because nothing says childhood like loading powder into a palm-sized pistol while your nanny looks on with mild disapproval. Playgrounds, as we know them, didn't really exist until the late Victorian era, and even then they were stiffly designed. The early versions were mostly sandpits and climbing frames made of iron bars bolted to stone. Soft landings? Non-existent. You fell, you bled. Maybe that's why they were called recreation grounds. Less about fun, or about recreating your ability to stand after a fall. Some progressive thinkers, pioneers like Friedrich Froebel and the early kindergarten movement, began to argue that play was essential to childhood development, that it helped the brain grow, that it was in fact not a waste of time. But in Victorian England, those voices were faint, and often dismissed as continental nonsense. Letting children play freely was seen as indulgent, dangerous even. Too much joy might lead to mischief. So tonight, you sit in the nursery, your toy soldier missing an arm and your knees still smarting from a fall, earlier no one acknowledged. You're told to be grateful, told to keep still, told that play is a privilege, not a right. You stare at your doll, its painted face cracking at the corners, and wonder if she feels as stiff and tired as you do. And tomorrow the fun ends. It's back to school, but don't get too excited. This isn't where you'll find refuge. It's where the rules get even tighter. The morning bell rings before the sun even dares show up. You're already dressed, of course. Victorian school days don't wait for anyone, especially not sleepy children. Your boots are laced tight. Your hair's been yanked into some form of order, and you're clutching a worn satchel filled with a slate, a stub of chalk, and a crust of bread masquerading as lunch. You head out into the foggy street with your back straight, eyes forward, and stomach fluttering. Because today is school, and in Victorian England, school isn't a place for learning so much as a place to break you in. Let's get one thing straight. The idea that all Victorian children went to school is mostly fiction. Education wasn't compulsory until 1880, and even then, enforcement was hit or miss. Before that, many kids worked full-time jobs and skipped formal schooling altogether. But if you were one of the lucky ones, your parents could scrape together a few pennies, or you qualified for a charity slot, then you found yourself in a classroom that was less Hogwarts, more moral boot camp with chalkboards. The building is cold, the floors are uneven. The windows don't open properly. Inside, desks are bolted to the floor in long rows, designed less for comfort and more for symmetry. You're crammed shoulder to shoulder with other children, many of whom are as anxious as you, others already numb to the whole process. Your teacher stands at the front like a statue with a pointer stick, eyes sharp, posture sharper. They don't smile, Not because they're mean, but because smiling might encourage the illusion that this is going to be fun. It isn't. Lessons begin with recitation. Loud, unified, mechanical. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8. You don't need to understand it, you just need to say it correctly and in time. The same goes for spelling, reading, and biblical passages. Individual expression? Not welcomed. You speak in unison or not at all. Questioning anything isn't curiosity, it's insubordination. And woe to the child who gets something wrong. The punishment is swift. Maybe a sharp whack on the knuckles with a ruler. Maybe a cane across the back of the legs. Maybe if you're too proud, you'll be made to stand in the corner wearing the dreaded dunce cap. A cone-shaped hat meant to shame you in front of your peers. Nothing quite reinforces learning like a public humiliation ritual. Let's talk tools. You're not working with pens and paper yet. Those are too expensive. You've got a slate and chalk, and you better not drop either. Chalk breaks are frowned upon. The slate must be wiped clean using a cloth, or, if you've lost it, your own sleeve. If it's too smudged, that's your fault too. Writing is stiff and looped, with endless drills in proper hand. Boys must write with masculine restraint. Girls must write with delicate curls. Penmanship isn't just a skill. It's a reflection of your moral fibre. And don't forget your school books, if your school even has them. Some schools shared between students, others had them chained to desks to prevent theft. Reading material was moralistic and dry, parables, sermons, and arithmetic problems disguised as stories. If a good boy walks 4 miles to church and a bad boy steals 2 apples, how many sins has each boy committed? That sort of thing. One of the more sinister elements of Victorian schooling was its obsession with obedience over knowledge. Teachers weren't trained in pedagogy. They were trained in control. Many came from religious backgrounds and believed education was less about academics and more about crushing the sinful instincts out of children. A well-educated child wasn't one who asked questions, it was one who could sit still for 6 hours without needing correction. And speaking of correction, corporal punishment was baked into the system. Literally. The law allowed teachers to hit students, and most did. Not just for misbehaviour, but for things like poor posture, looking out the window, or, my personal favourite, poor facial expression. If you looked smug, sullen, or bored, you could be punished for attitude. Even yawning was considered offensive. For girls, there was an added layer of rules. Posture, tone, hair neatness, skirt length, how they crossed their ankles. Girls were taught reading, writing, sewing, and obedience. Science, maybe, but not much. That was for boys, who were assumed to be heading into trades or business. Girls were trained for service, marriage, and domestic excellence. Let's not ignore the fringe schools, the dame schools run by widows or older women from their homes. These were small, informal setups where children learned the basics. Alphabet, numbers, and how to stay quiet while sitting in a cold parlour for 6 hours. Quality varied wildly, some were nurturing. Others were little more than indoor babysitting with a Bible and a cane. On the opposite end, you had the boarding schools, especially for upper-class children. These were rigid institutions with uniforms, Latin, Greek, and plenty of emotional repression. Boys were often separated from home at the age of 7 or 8, and raised in dormitories where affection was scarce and hazing was common. Some became scholars, others became bitter, hollow-eyed men who wrote poetry about being ignored for 12 years. One curious fringe fact: some schools had monitor systems where older students were tasked with teaching younger ones. Sounds nice until you realise the monitors were also given permission to punish their charges. Yes, children were allowed to punish other children with slaps, kicks, and writing penalties. That definitely never went wrong. Now let's pause for the classroom debate of the century. Rote memorisation versus critical thinking. There were, even then, some educators arguing that children should be taught to understand, not just repeat. That questions should be encouraged. That curiosity was a good thing. These ideas were labelled radical and dangerously progressive, because of course they were. Most Victorian education reformers were fighting uphill battles, and their successes came slowly, often decades too late for the children already bruised and shamed into submission. And then there were exams. Tests weren't just academic, they were moral. Fail, and you might be punished. Pass, and you might earn a reward. A prayer book, a penny, a ribbon, not much, but enough to dangle the idea of praise, still chinned. Most children left school without a sense of accomplishment, just a vague fear of authority and a desire to never write another sentence on a slate as long as they lived. So tonight, as you sit at the dinner table trying not to hunch, your fingers stained with chalk dust and your head full of arithmetic and commandments, you feel tired. Not just physically, but deeply, quietly tired. You've done everything right, stood straight, recited well, kept your face neutral, and still there was the cane. Still there was the silence. Still there was the shame of not being good enough. And tomorrow, more of the same, unless you ask a question. In which case, worse. It's late and the nursery feels unusually quiet tonight. No scolding, no shuffling of slates gone. Just the soft creak of the rocking chair and the faint ticking of a wall clock that's always 5 minutes fast. You've been told to get ready for bed, but you don't move right away. Something's different. You can feel it in your stomach like a storm rolling in, not outside but inside you. Because today you've done something wrong. Or maybe you haven't. Honestly, you're not sure anymore. In a Victorian household, guilt isn't about facts. It's about atmosphere. And you've stepped into it again. You try to retrace your steps. You spilled ink on your copybook. Or was it that you sighed too loudly in arithmetic? Or maybe it was earlier when you dared to ask if you could switch your soup with your brother's, because his had more carrots. The offence doesn't matter. The feeling does. And that feeling is shame. A constant companion in Victorian parenting, more reliable than bedtime prayers or cold porridge. Let's talk about it. Victorian child rearing was built on a towering mountain of guilt and shame. These weren't just original tools for correcting misbehaviour, they were the foundation of all discipline. If corporal punishment was the body's correction, guilt was the soul's. And unlike a bruise, it didn't fade by morning. From the moment you could talk, you were introduced to the idea that your actions, your thoughts, even your feelings could displease someone. God, your parents, your governess, the Queen, take your pick. The key lesson was that you were never quite good enough. Your best behaviour could always be better. Your most thoughtful action could still carry a hidden selfishness. Smiling too proudly? That's vanity. Speaking too confidently? Arrogance. Even enjoying your meal too much might be seen as gluttony or self-indulgence. One Victorian guide for mothers warned that children should be discouraged from asking for more food, lest they develop an appetite for excess. Translation: hunger is fine, just don't enjoy it. This moral training was doled out in quiet, strategic doses. A long look, a sigh, a slight shake of the head. These gestures carried more weight than a slap. They weren't just punishments, they were disappointments. And to a Victorian child, there was nothing more terrifying than disappointing someone you depended on for survival. Here's how it might play out. You break a dish. Not on purpose, just a slip. The response? Not yelling, not yet. Your governess simply says, "I expected better from you." That's it. But now your stomach drops, your ears burn, you'd have preferred a scolding. At least that would end. But this lingers. She expected better. And so clearly you're not enough. Religious guilt played its own starring role. You're told that God sees everything, even your thoughts. If you envy your sibling's toy, that's a sin. If you wish someone would be kinder to you, selfishness. You must be grateful, humble, ignorant and penitent, always. Victorian children were instructed to confess sins daily, even when they weren't sure they'd committed any, just in case. One popular children's devotional encouraged a nightly reflection by asking, "What did you do today that might have hurt God's heart?" Imagine being 6 and believing you made God sad because you wanted the bigger biscuit. Even bedtime prayers weren't comforting. The famous "Now I lay me down to sleep" took on a different tone when you genuinely feared death by influenza, chimney fire, or a rogue hoof on the street. You'd pray for forgiveness if I should die before I wake, knowing full well that many children did just that. You weren't being reassured, you were being reminded. This culture of shame wasn't limited to misbehaviour, it bled into identity. Left-handed children were corrected with strict handwriting drills, sometimes even physical restraints. If you preferred quiet play instead of loud sports, you were labelled delicate or sullen. Boys who cried were mocked or punished. Girls who spoke boldly were called hysterical. You weren't raised to discover who you were moulded into who you should be. Let's not forget the ever-present public correction. Victorian parents believed in shaming by example. You might be called out in front of guests, reminded loudly not to stand like a street urchin, or eat like a stable boy. Some parents even made their children perform small punishments publicly, standing silently in the room during a visit, wearing a sign describing their offence or reciting a moral poem they clearly didn't understand, and yes, they wrote poems for this. One particularly grim example included a verse about a girl who fibbed and was struck by lightning. Not metaphorically, just straight up smote. Another described a boy who ignored his mother's call and was found frozen to death in the snow. Victorian moral literature was less gentle guidance and more spiritual hostage situation. Of course, some of this guilt was generational. Parents who'd been raised with shame passed it down like a family heirloom. They weren't villains, they truly believed it was their duty, that without guilt, children would turn wild. Disrespectful, unmarriageable, so they doubled down, convinced that the tightrope of constant correction was the only path to proper adulthood. But what about the children? Some internalized it completely, growing into adults with perfectly straight backs and permanently furrowed brows. Others developed secret lives, hiding notebooks, whispering jokes behind doors, rehearsing apologies for sins they hadn't committed. Emotional self-editing began early and ran deep. You learned to sense the mood of a room before you entered it. You practiced smiling just enough. You trained your voice to sound neither too eager nor too indifferent. Quirky fringe fact, there were even shame benches sold to schools and churches, wooden seats placed at the front of a classroom or a chapel, where a child would sit if they'd misbehaved, or simply failed to meet expectations. They'd sit facing the congregation, lesson, or service, forced to endure a full hour of vehement public disapproval. It was theatre, really. The audience always knew their part. Even when guilt didn't lead to punishment, it rarely led to forgiveness. Victorian forgiveness was not about closure. It was about endurance. If you were told, "I forgive you," it usually came with a side of, "but I won't forget." The ledger wasn't cleared, just noted. So tonight, as you sit on the edge of your bed, staring at the wash basin, hands folded neatly in your lap, you don't know what exactly you did, but you know you feel wrong. You've been told to reflect, so you do. You try to remember what you said, how you sat, who you looked at, and for how long. You search for the moment where you disappointed them, your parents, your governess, God himself. You don't find it, but you still whisper a quiet, guilty apology into the silence, just in case. Tomorrow you'll be back in your corset or collar, spine straight, conscience raw, because in the Victorian home, guilt wasn't something you learned to overcome, it was something you were trained to live with. The morning is unusually quiet, eerily so. There's a kind of tension in the air, like something's expected of you that you haven't been told. You're already dressed, your boots are on the wrong feet again, and your hair's been yanked into a respectable style, but something feels off. The nanny eyes you for a little too long, the maid doesn't smile. Your mother is nowhere to be seen. Then, just as you reach for the banister, a voice cuts through the silence like a blade. "Stand up straight! You're old enough to carry yourself with dignity." Ah, there it is. Today you're not just a child. Today you're an apprentice adult. And that means you're being presented, for judgment, for comparison, for the slow erosion of everything spontaneous and joyful inside of you. Because in Victorian England, children were not nurtured into adulthood. They were gradually shamed into it. Let's start with girls, because unfortunately the rules came for them sooner and sharper. By the age of 7 or 8, a girl was expected to behave like a young lady, which is a polite way of saying she was expected to disappear into softness, obedience, and penitence. That means a change in posture, a change in speech, and of course a change in clothing. Say goodbye to anything comfortable. Say hello to baby's first corset. Yes, corsets for children. You thought those whalebone nightmares were just for grown women with tightly packed drawing rooms and even tighter waists. Think again. Victorian girls were often laced into training corsets by age 6 or 7. Why? Because posture was moral, and slouching was a slippery slope to sin. A girl who stood up straight was a girl with discipline, virtue, and most importantly, a marketable figure for future marriage. The corset started mild, relatively speaking, a few stiffened panels, gentle lacing, just enough to teach her how to hold her stomach in and lift her chest. But over time, as she grew, the corset grew tighter, the boning more rigid. Breathing became a learned skill. Bending over required a strategy. One handmaid reported that her young mistress once fainted in church, not because she was ill, but because she had sneezed while too tightly laced. That was considered a minor inconvenience. The important thing was that her waist looked delicate, and yes, they measured, literally. A proper waist size was often under 20 inches for a fully grown woman, but training began well before puberty. Some girls had their waistlines logged in diaries by proud mothers. Sarah, 21 inches today, very promising. Promising for what exactly? For being married off as soon as legally feasible. Now the dangers of corsets are well documented. Crushed ribs, displaced organs, chronic shortness of breath. But perhaps the greatest damage was psychological. Girls were taught from the very beginning that their value lived not in their minds, their talents, or even their kindness, but in how small, silent, and cinched they could become. Let's not forget the etiquette. Girls had to learn how to sit without slouching, walk without stomping, smile without grinning, and laugh, but only softly and only when appropriate. One etiquette book warned that giggling reveals a lack of feminine self-control. Another said that girls who ran were at risk of developing forward personalities. So yes, if you were a Victorian girl and you felt a surge of excitement, your job was to suppress it immediately. Boys, of course, didn't wear corsets, but don't worry, they weren't exactly enjoying freedom. Instead of being made small, they were made hard. Victorian boys were taught to bury their emotions in a deep, dark vault, somewhere between their liver and their spine. Tears were for infants, kindness was weakness, and expressing feelings, that was borderline treason. Boys learned the art of emotional control through stoic exercises. These weren't formal lessons, but daily rituals of dismissal and deflection. Fall off your pony, stand up and don't whimper. Lose a prized possession, be grateful for the lesson in detachment. Get caned at school, don't flinch, never flinch, that's how you earn respect. You earn it by pretending pain doesn't exist. One fringe fact, some fathers encouraged their sons to sleep on wooden boards instead of mattresses, to toughen the spirit. Others withheld hugs past infancy. Physical affection was reserved for military victories, and even then, only with a firm handshake. If you grew up with tenderness, it was considered a threat to your masculinity. Boys were encouraged to train for battle before they even had adult teeth. This all fed into a broader Victorian philosophy. Emotions are obstacles. Feelings cloud judgment. So children were coached into not feeling, or at least never showing it. You could cry maybe, but alone, quietly, and with the door shut. But not every child could keep the mask on. Some cracked, some wept, some shouted back. And when they did, they were labelled difficult, melancholy, sickly, or worst of all, hysterical. Boys were sent to boarding schools or apprenticeships to be straightened out. Girls were locked in bedrooms or taken to doctors for rest cures, which often meant being confined to bed in silence, fed milk, and forbidden from doing anything at all, not even reading. Yes, you could be prescribed boredom as a medicine for your personality. Victorian medicine loved to pathologise emotion, melancholia, nervous disorder, hysteria. Everything from excitement to sadness could be medicalised and treated with rest, cold baths, or, in more disturbing cases, mild electric shocks. A child who didn't conform wasn't just rebellious. They were ill. Even art and creativity were suspect. Children who doodled too much or wrote imaginary stories or talked to themselves were watched closely. That kind of behaviour wasn't charming, it was seen as a possible gateway to madness, especially in girls. A daydreaming girl was a dangerous girl. Better to give her a sampler to embroider. At least that kept her fingers and her mind occupied. And let's not forget the beloved Victorian pastime of comparison. You were constantly measured, not just in inches, but against your siblings, your neighbours, the children in church. Why can't you be more like Arthur? He never complains. Emily already knows her psalms. Why are you so behind? You weren't raised as an individual, you were part of a scorecard. One misstep and the whole family's reputation took a hit. So tonight, as you lie in bed, your ribs sore from the corset that's already reshaping your body, or your face stiff from holding in tears over a scolding you didn't earn. You wonder who you're supposed to be tomorrow. Quieter, straighter, sharper. You go over every word you said today, every expression you wore, every sigh that might have been a little too loud. You don't want to be difficult. You want to be praised. You want to feel worthy. But worthiness here doesn't come from being yourself. It comes from being less of yourself. Tomorrow, you'll try harder. Smile more gently. Speak even less. Maybe then they'll say you're becoming a proper young lady, or shaping up into a fine young man. And maybe, just maybe that ache in your chest will finally quiet down. The morning light creeps in through the lace curtains, casting delicate little patterns across the nursery floor. You're awake, but you don't move. You're afraid to. Because today is fitting day, a phrase that sounds harmless until you remember the last one. There was poking, pulling, endless pins, and your arms falling asleep while the seamstress barks at you to stop breathing like a peasant. You're not a peasant, of course, you're a child of quality, which means you're expected to be dressed like a miniature adult, stiff, suffocating, and terrifyingly delicate. And so begins another charming aspect of Victorian parenting, the obsession with appearance, especially when it came to children. Not comfort, not practicality, appearance. You weren't just expected to behave like a model citizen, and you were expected to look like one too, preferably in an outfit that made you feel like a particularly overdressed statue. Let's start with girls. Victorian girlhood, for the middle and upper classes, was basically one long runway show in a museum where everything hurts. You wore dresses with multiple layers, petticoats, drawers, corset, yes, still, blouse, overskirt, apron, sash, hat, gloves, and sometimes a tiny handbag with nothing in it but lint and regret. These weren't play clothes, these were costumes, and you had many of them. One for morning, one for visiting, one for walking, one for tea, one for dinner, and one for not being spoken to in public. And let's not forget the lace. Lace on your collar, lace on your cuffs, lace on your socks, your sleeves, your underskirt. You looked like a doily come to life. This lace was starched within an inch of its existence, meaning it didn't bend, move, or feel nice. It scratched, itched, made you sweat in places you didn't know could sweat. But that didn't matter. If you tugged at it, you'd be scolded for fidgeting. If you sweated, you'd be scolded for lacking refinement. So you learned to be still, quiet, red-faced, but dignified. One bizarre fringe rule: if a girl's hemline showed too much ankle, even if she was a literal child, it was seen as suggestive. That's right. Victorian society managed to sexualize ankles. Many dresses were cut long enough to skim the floor, just to avoid the moral catastrophe of an 11-year-old showing too much shin. Imagine trying to play jump rope in that. Actually, don't. You weren't supposed to be jumping rope anyway. Far too vigorous. And what about the hair? Oh, the hair. Girls were expected to wear it long, shiny, and perfectly parted. This required endless brushing. 100 strokes, they said, for gloss. Combs made of bone or wood scraped through knots while you sat still as a statue. Tears gathering but never falling. Because crying was for babies. You weren't a baby, you were a proper young lady, and you would sit there until your scalp went numb and your mother was satisfied with the discipline of your part line. Now let's shift to the boys. You'd think they had it easier. Fewer layers, no corsets, less lace. And sure, on paper that's true, but what they did wear came with its own brand of quiet misery. First there were the sailor suits. Yes, the sailor suits. Every respectable boy at some point found himself shoved into a stiff boxy navy ensemble, complete with decorative buttons, a wide white collar and a little hat. This was fashionable. This was patriotic. This was what Queen Victoria's own sons wore, and therefore, so must you. Sailor suits were symbolic, they said. This boy is being groomed for honour, duty and national pride, even if you were 7 and cried when your pudding touched your peas. There were also velvet suits, tight trousers, blousy shirts with wide collars, and bows so big you could have used them to sail away from your own embarrassment. And if your parents really wanted to show off, a lace collar, yes, for boys too. Picture a future banker or military officer waddling around in ruffles that would make Marie Antoinette blush. The shoes were shiny but unforgiving, narrow, stiff, and laced so tightly your toes whispered their last goodbyes halfway through a walk. And to walk, always pulled up to the knee and fastened with garters, because droopy socks were a sign of moral decay. Truly, it gets worse. Until around age 5 or 6, boys and girls were dressed identically in dresses. This wasn't about gender fluidity, it was about convenience and tradition. Young boys in frocks were easier to toilet train, apparently, and also cheaper to clothe until they earned their trousers. This transition was called breeching, and it was a big deal. A breeching ceremony meant you were no longer a baby, you were now a boy. You might get new clothes, have your portrait painted, or even be allowed a small glass of wine at dinner. So congratulations, you've earned your first taste of masculinity, along with a waistband that feels like it was designed by a corset apprentice. And heaven help the child who got these clothes dirty. Victorian garments were expensive, not because they were comfortable or durable, but because they were status symbols. If you came home with a rip, stain or tear, you were subject to immediate scolding, or worse, the dreaded look of parental disgust. Some children were made to sit in their ruined clothes all evening as punishment, a reminder of their shame. Others were forced to hand wash them themselves, learning the hard way that mud and velvet don't mix. Laundry days were nightmares for everyone, but especially children with delicate garments. You watched your best dress hang by its sleeves, dripping like some sad ghost, and prayed it wouldn't shrink or tear. If it did, no sympathy. You were accused of disrespecting your station. A quirky fringe fashion fact. Some children wore mourning outfits regularly, not because someone had died, but because black clothes were more practical and mature. Children in mourning dress looked like little Victorian vampires, sombre, pale, and smothered in crepe. It was fashionable. It was practical. It was bleak. And then came the portraits. Every child, especially in wealthier homes, would at some point be dressed within an inch of their life and marched to a photography studio. You'd stand for hours while someone adjusted your hands, tilted your chin, told you not to blink, and insisted you hold perfectly still while the camera captured your soul and your shoulder ache. The result? A photograph of a child who looks haunted, exhausted, and vaguely unsure if they've just committed a crime. That was the ideal. So tonight, you undress slowly. Buttons, laces, stockings, corset, you rub your ribs. Your feet throb, your scalp still tingles from the comb. You stare at your crumpled socks and the polished shoes placed neatly by the bed, and wonder what it would feel like to just be. To run barefoot through mud, to let your shirt untuck, to breathe deeply without measuring your waist. But tomorrow is another day, another outfit, another judgment, another hour in front of the mirror trying to become what they want to see. And if you're lucky, maybe you'll earn a single compliment. Something like, "You look very tidy," which, in Victorian England, is the closest thing to love. The house is quiet tonight. The kind of quiet that settles into your bones, stiff and heavy. You sit at the edge of your bed, staring at your hands, trying not to feel much of anything, because you've been warned feeling too much is dangerous, especially if you're a boy. And today, like most days, something felt like it might push through. The burning behind your eyes, the tightness in your throat, that ache in your chest that says, "Please, just let me cry." But you didn't. You held it in because in Victorian England, boys don't cry ever. This wasn't just a family rule, it was a cultural commandment. From the moment a boy could walk and talk, he was told implicitly and explicitly that emotions were not welcome, not the big ones, not the small ones, and definitely not the wet ones. You could laugh, sure, as long as it was restrained and not too loud. You could get angry, especially if it was the righteous, manly kind of anger. But sadness, vulnerability, tears, those were signs of weakness. And weakness was an offence. Let's say you scrape your knee. The blood trickles down your leg and it hurts. But you bite your lip. You know better than to whimper. Someone nearby, maybe your father or an older cousin or even the gardener, says, "Be brave now," or "Don't cry like a girl." And there it is, the double blow. Not only are you told that your pain isn't valid, you're told that expressing it makes you feminine. And femininity, in this context, is shorthand for shame. Victorian masculinity was a prison made of starched collars and silence. Boys were trained in stoicism before they knew how to spell it. They were praised for being quiet, resolute, firm, and mature for their age. What that really meant was they learned not to feel, or at least not to show it. Crying was considered unmanly, un-British, and, most insultingly of all, childish. You might be 6 years old, but if you shed a tear, someone somewhere was already calling you a disappointment. The rhetoric was everywhere, in school books, in church sermons, in father's advice and mother's weary sighs. Even nursery rhymes reinforced the message. One cheerful little ditty ends with a boy falling off a wall and everyone moves on. No tears, no sympathy, just another bump, another lesson. One curious historical detail. Victorian medical literature began to pathologise male emotion. Doctors claimed boys who cried too much had nervous conditions, or were constitutionally weak. Emotional boys might be sent away for sea air, cold baths, or long walks, anything to build the nerves. Yes, that's right. Feeling too deeply could get you prescribed exercise and isolation. And if you really couldn't get it under control, You might find yourself in a disciplinary school or a reform home. There, physical labour, religious recitation, and total emotional suppression were prescribed as a cure for your delicate temperament. Imagine a 12-year-old sensitive and overwhelmed, crying at the death of a family pet, only to be shipped off to chop wood in silence for a month as punishment. Even within the home, there was a hierarchy of acceptable emotion. A father might pat your shoulder if you fell, maybe even say that's enough now. But a hug? Not likely. A kiss? Only if you were under 3, and even then. Preferably on the forehead, and preferably not in public. Victorian fathers were expected to be distant, authoritative, and emotionally impenetrable. Sons were taught to emulate that as early as possible. Mothers were sometimes more forgiving, sometimes, but even then, affection had boundaries. If you cried too long or too loudly, you were told to hush. If you sought comfort too often, you were reminded that boys must learn to be men. And being a man in this era meant learning to carry your pain like a pocket watch, close to your chest and never discussed. Of course, the consequences were inevitable. Boys grew into men who didn't know how to process grief, loss, or even joy. Emotions didn't disappear, they just turned inward. Repressed emotion often leaked out sideways, in rage, in cruelty and distance. Some Victorian men kept stiff diaries filled with entries like "You, wife passed today, cold snap expected tomorrow." That was the whole note. Decades of silence packed into 5 words. Let's step into the classroom for a moment. Victorian boys' schools, especially the elite ones, were emotional deserts. Strict discipline, long days, cold mornings, teachers who ruled with canes and cold glares. A boy who wept after a beating was mocked by his peers and ignored by his instructor. A boy who didn't cry was told he had spirit, but not too much spirit, or you'd be accused of rebellion. It was a delicate, soul-killing balance, and yet in the shadows of this culture, some boys did cry. Quietly, in stables, behind hedges, under blankets at night when the house was finally silent. Some wrote poems and buried them in the garden. Some sketched sad little portraits of their pets or imaginary friends. These were acts of defiance, small rebellions against the emotional straitjacket they were forced to wear. One fringe case tells of a boy who cried during a sermon about the crucifixion, overwhelmed not by doctrine but by empathy. His teacher scolded him afterwards, saying, "We do not cry over stories, we pray." The boy later grew up to be a poet whose work was banned in several schools for being too sentimental. Victorian society was great at turning sensitivity into scandal. There were cracks in the system. Late in the century, a few brave educators and writers began questioning the emotional starvation of boys. They argued for play, for tenderness, for the right to feel without punishment. Some pushed for co-education, thinking girls' presence might soften the harshness. Others promoted music and art therapy. But these were whispers in a storm of discipline. The majority still clung to the belief that a boy who could not cry was a man in the making. So tonight, as you lie stiff in your bed, your stomach tight and your eyes burning, you hold it in. You want to cry because today was awful. Because your teacher hit you in front of the whole class. Because your dog hasn't come back. Because someone laughed when you fell, but you don't. You just stare at the ceiling and blink hard. Oh. Because that's what good boys do. Because if you cry, you're weak. If you're weak, you're not a man. And if you're not a man, then what are you? Tomorrow you'll put your boots on. You'll walk like everything is fine, you'll keep your voice steady, and no one will ever know how close you came. It's gone dark and the lamps haven't been lit yet. You're sitting near the window, forehead resting against the cold glass. Eyes tracking the dim outlines of houses across the street. You're counting them like you always do. 1, 2, 3, 4, until you get to the 5th, the one with the missing child. You heard about it yesterday. A boy, maybe 10, vanished after running an errand. No one's seen him since. His mother fainted. The father said very little. And today, no one's talking about it anymore. The city just moved on, same as always, because in Victorian England, children disappear all the time. Runaways, lost ones, thrown away ones. It's not even considered newsworthy unless you were particularly wealthy or particularly tragic. For everyone else, vanishing was something that simply happened. Shrugged off, folded into the smog. The Industrial Revolution didn't just swallow up factory workers and coal miners, it also devoured children one by one, day after day, until people stopped asking where they went. Let's start with the runaways. Picture a child around your age, 7, maybe 12, slip-tipping out of the house before dawn. Maybe they were beaten too hard last night. Maybe they're hungry. Always. Maybe they've been told one too many times that they're a burden. So they leave. No bags, no shoes sometimes. They walk until the street noise feels unfamiliar, then disappear into the machinery of the city. No one calls the police. There's no Amber Alert. The parents might ask him around at the market or church, but after a day or two, they stop. A missing child is bad for reputation. Now imagine a child isn't just lost, but intentionally discarded. It happened. Families who couldn't afford another mouth to feed would send a child to the country to stay with distant relatives who may or may not exist. Sometimes the child was handed off to a workhouse, an apprenticeship, or, if you were upper class and properly strategic, quietly enrolled in a boarding school and never spoken of again. Like a seasonal coat, tucked into the back of a closet. Forgotten. But not entirely. The workhouses were particularly bleak. Officially, they were designed to support the poor. Unofficially, they were a machine for sifting out the unwanted. Parents brought children to these institutions under the guise of giving them shelter, but really, it was about removing them from sight. Workhouses kept records, but they weren't detailed. If a child died of illness or accident, and many did, they were buried in unmarked graves. Their names might not even make it to the weekly report. Just another number lost in the margins. One disturbing fringe fact: some families sold their children. Not openly, of course. Victorians loved to pretend everything was above board. But informally, it happened. A child would be apprenticed to a chimney sweep or sent to a merchant in another town. In exchange, the parents might receive a small fee or a promise of clothing and education that never actually arrived. If the child never came back, no one really asked why. And then there were the children who simply vanished. London in particular was a labyrinth of alleys, cellars, docks, and soot-blackened corners. It was entirely possible for a child to step out for an errand and never return. Maybe they were kidnapped. Maybe they fell into the river. Maybe they were hit by a carriage and buried as a John Doe. If someone saw it happen, they probably didn't say anything. Victorians had a remarkable ability to compartmentalise tragedy, especially when it came to the lower classes. Police involvement was rare. There were no organised search parties, no posters, no community outcry. Missing children, unless noble or rich, simply weren't a priority. The Metropolitan Police might file a brief report, ask a few questions, and move on. Occasionally a story would reach the papers, a particularly grisly one, usually involving a body. But even then, the public response was more curiosity than outrage. Tragedy had to be interesting to be mourned. Meanwhile, life went on. Parents who lost children were expected to maintain composure. Grief was a private thing, and mourning was mostly symbolic. Black armbands, veils, quiet dinners. Expressing too much emotion in public was frowned upon, especially for fathers. And if a child ran away, many parents would tell people the child had died. It was easier that way, less humiliating than admitting they'd been driven out or fled from something unspoken. There's a tragic consistency in all of this. Children in the Victorian era were not treated as autonomous beings with inherent worth. They were seen as extensions of the family name, the household machine, or the economic ladder. If one was lost, another could be made, not always so coldly, of course, but often with a kind of emotional detachment that feels unthinkable now. But some people did care. There were early child advocates, clergymen, doctors, even some journalists who tried to raise awareness. They published pamphlets, started orphanages with better conditions, pushed for stronger legal protections. Some even kept personal logs of missing children they'd encountered in the streets. But without centralised support, their efforts were drops in an ocean. A peculiar historical footnote: a few children who vanished were later found, working under false names, hidden in rural towns, or posing as someone else's child entirely. Some had fled abuse, others had simply tried to disappear. One boy became a cabin hand on a ship and didn't surface again until his 20s. He'd run away at 9. His parents had already held a memorial. Tonight you sit quietly at the window watching the fog roll in over cobblestones. Somewhere, someone's calling a name, softly, urgently. And somewhere else, a child is pressing themselves against a wall, praying not to be found. You wonder what happened to that boy down the street. You wonder how long his family will pretend nothing happened. You wonder if they'll cry about it, or just move his chair out of the dining room and never speak his name again. And you wonder, just for a second, what would happen if you disappeared? Would they notice? Would they call for you? Would they let you go? Tomorrow the sun will rise. Well, another child will slip through the cracks, and the world will go on. Because in Victorian England, being invisible is safer than being seen. The house smells faintly of boiled starch and furniture polish tonight, a scent you've come to associate with women who never stop moving. She's here again, the nanny, or the governess, or the nursemaid. Honestly, at this point, it's hard to keep track of who she is, because she's always there but never quite seen. She buttons your cuffs, brushes lint off your shoulder, smooths your hair with a firm but not unkind hand. You don't know much about her. You know her shoes squeak, her eyes are tired, and she's always the one who carries you up the stairs when you fall asleep at the table. This is another hidden corner of Victorian parenting, the nannies. The women who raised the children of families that didn't want to, or couldn't, do it themselves. They weren't mothers, but they were more than servants. They were the invisible glue holding everything together, while being paid almost nothing and treated like part of the furniture. For wealthier households, the nanny was practically a surrogate parent. She woke the children, bathed them, dressed them, fed them, schooled them, disciplined them, tucked them in at night. Meanwhile, the actual parents might pop in for 10 minutes a day, perhaps after dinner, perhaps to inspect posture, perhaps to smile faintly and then retreat to the drawing room. The children learned quickly. Affection, comfort and stability came not from mother or father, but from the woman in the plain dress who smelled like soap and tea leaves. But nannies weren't all sugar and lullabies. Many were as strict, sometimes stricter, than the parents. Their job wasn't to nurture in the modern sense. It was to produce obedient, presentable children. That meant cold baths at dawn, endless drills of thank you and please, and a constant watch over every action. She could be your lifeline and your jailer all at once. She'd kiss your scraped knee but slap your wrist for squirming at the dinner table. Love and discipline blurred. Nannies themselves were usually working-class women with limited options. Some were widows, some were unmarried daughters sent into service. A few were wet nurses whose roles had evolved as the children grew older. They lived in small attic rooms, often next to the nursery, and rarely left the house except on designated half-days. Their wages were low, their hours endless, and their social status complicated. They were neither family nor servant, yet somehow both. The emotional toll was heavy. These women raised children from infancy, sometimes loving them more deeply than their biological parents did. But when the children grew older, sent off to school, or married out, they were expected to let go without complaint. No letters, no visits, no acknowledgement of the bond they had formed. Some nannies moved on to new families. Others stayed behind, quietly fading into the background of the household until their health gave out. One fringe fact, some nannies were forbidden to speak in their native dialects. Irish and Scottish women especially were told to correct their accents lest the children pick them up. This meant suppressing not only their language but their identity. Imagine spending your days raising someone else's child while erasing your own voice. The relationship between mothers and nannies was often tense. A mother might resent the closeness between her children and the woman paid to raise them. Or she might simply delegate everything and feel no guilt at all. Some mothers bragged about how little they handled their infants, boasting that their child never cries for me. This was considered proof of good breeding and self-control. In reality, it often meant the child had learned not to expect comfort from its own mother. For the children, the nanny was both sanctuary and surveillance. She was the one who whispered a lullaby when you were sick, but also the one who told your father if you spilled soup on your shirt. You learned to read her moods like weather. Her sigh meant she was tired, her silence meant trouble was coming, her rare smile meant you were safe, for a moment. Boarding schools and apprenticeships eventually broke these bonds. Boys were sent off to live with strangers, girls were married out. The nanny's work ended where another kind of confinement began. And yet, long after, many Victorian adults wrote about their nannies with aching fondness. They remembered the scent of her apron, the sound of her voice, the way she'd rub their temples when they had headaches. Some even left them money in their wills. Others, especially upper-class men, tried to forget the affection altogether, because it embarrassed them to admit their only real mother figure had been a paid servant. The irony of Victorian child-rearing is that the people most responsible for shaping children's lives were also the ones least acknowledged by history. Nannies didn't have their portraits painted. They didn't get statues, they weren't invited to weddings. They vanished from the record like ghosts, even as their influence lingered. In every stitch of manners and every scar of repression, their charges carried into adulthood. A quirky example. In some houses, nannies weren't allowed to eat with the servants or the family. They had to eat alone in a small windowless room called the nanny's pantry. These spaces were often just big enough for a chair and a tray. Imagine spending all day with children, then eating dinner in a glorified closet. That was the reality for thousands of women. Tonight, as you lie in bed, you hear her soft footsteps in the hall. She pauses, just for a moment, outside your door. Maybe she's checking if you're asleep. Maybe she's debating whether to go in and adjust your blanket. Maybe she's just catching her breath before returning to her tiny attic room. You don't say anything, she doesn't either. But for a heartbeat, the house feels less cold. And then the moment passes. Tomorrow she'll wake you before dawn, dress you, scold you, feed you and send you off again. And you'll pretend you don't care when she disappears into her room at night. Because in Victorian England, the people who cared for you the most were often the people you weren't supposed to notice. It's morning again. Though the room feels darker than usual, the curtains are still drawn and there's a faint acrid smell drifting in from the street. Coal smoke mixed with something sweet, almost medicinal. Your nanny is at your bedside, her mouth set in that tight line you've learned to recognise. Today is medicine day. You don't even feel sick, not exactly, but your parents have been told this is for your constitution. You know better than to protest. Victorian medicine isn't a suggestion, it's an order. Welcome to the strange, sometimes horrifying world of children's healthcare in the 19th century, a time when treatments were more superstition than science, and the cure was often as dangerous as the illness itself. If you thought the cane at school was scary, wait until you taste what's in that spoon. Let's start with the basics, everyday tonics. Every Victorian household had a cupboard full of bottles promising to strengthen nerves, improve appetite, or purify the blood. For children, this meant daily doses of concoctions that might contain alcohol, laudanum, which is opium, mercury, or even arsenic in small amounts. Yes, arsenic. It was believed to stimulate growth and brighten the complexion. Parents dosed their children with poison, believing it was good parenting. Some bottles even came with smiling baby illustrations on the label, as if to reassure you the narcotics were wholesome. Cough? Here's some syrup with morphine. Trouble sleeping? Laudanum-laced cordial. Teething? Rub the baby's gums with opium powder. In one particularly popular remedy, a soothing syrup for infants promised to quiet any cry within 10 minutes. It worked, all right. By stating babies so thoroughly they sometimes stopped breathing. Newspapers occasionally printed stories about accidental overdoses, but they were usually framed as isolated tragedies, not an indictment of the products themselves. The market rolled on. Then there were the poultices, plasters and drawing salves that Victorians swore by. Got a fever? Slather mustard on your chest and wrap yourself in flannel until you're red and gasping. Stomachache? A poultice of bread, milk and vinegar pressed against your belly until it burns. Cuts and scrapes were routinely treated with carbolic acid, which did disinfect but also stung like fire. Kids learned to grit their teeth during healing just like they did during punishment. If you were truly unlucky, you might encounter bloodletting. Yes, even in the 9th century. Although it was on the decline, some doctors still believed that draining a child's blood could rebalance the humours and cure fever, irritability, or even bad behaviour. Leeches were sometimes used instead of scalpels. Tiny black worms clinging to your skin while the adults murmured about your impure blood. You lay still, terrified, as your life literally drained into a jar. Vaccinations existed but were controversial. The smallpox vaccine had been developed decades earlier, but Victorian parents were divided about whether to use it. Some lined up their children for inoculation in church halls or charity clinics, hoping to save them from a horrible death. Others believed it was dangerous, unnatural, or even ungodly. Conspiracy theories spread through pamphlets. The vaccine would turn children bovine, poison their spirits, or mark them forever. Sound familiar? Even then, public health was a battlefield. Fringe fact, before sterile needles, vaccines were often administered arm to arm. A bit of pus from a vaccinated person was scratched into a cut on the next child's arm. In some cases, this spread other diseases, syphilis for example. Imagine lining up for a life-saving procedure and catching something worse instead. That's the gamble Victorian parents took. Home remedies were a mixed bag. Some were harmless, chamomile tea, honey, warm compresses. Others were downright dangerous. Parents fed children gin for sleep, gave them turpentine for worms, or made them inhale burning herbs for lung clearing. Doctors were expensive. So many families treated illness at home, until it was about too late. Infant mortality was staggering. Up to 1 in 5 babies in industrial cities never reached their first birthday. In some neighbourhoods, the odds were worse. Even in wealthy homes, medical care could be brutal. Physicians often prescribed harsh purgatives, calomel, a mercury compound, to clean out the system, or castor oil to stimulate the bowels. You might be racked with cramps for days, but at least your mother could reassure herself that the badness is leaving your body. Pain was interpreted as proof the cure was working. And don't forget mental health. Children who exhibited signs of melancholy, anxiety, or nervousness were often dosed with tonics or subjected to rest cures, essentially forced inactivity. No play, no reading, no stimulation, just lying in bed while someone checks your pulse and feeds you bland food. It was supposed to calm the nerves. It often just deepened despair. One bizarre fringe treatment involved electrical therapy. Small dolls, hand-cranked devices were sold to parents who believed a jolt of current could correct everything from stuttering to feeble-mindedness. Imagine sitting in a stiff chair while your father applies metal paddles to your arms, promising it will make you stronger. That was a Saturday afternoon in some homes. Of course, not every Victorian doctor was a quack. There were advances, antiseptics, anaesthesia, early public health measures. Some physicians genuinely tried to improve children's lives, but the system as a whole was experimental at best, lethal at worst. Children were the testing ground, their bodies the battlefield of superstition and science colliding. Tonight, as you sit on the edge of the bed, the nanny hands you a spoonful of something dark and sticky. You can smell the alcohol before it even reaches your lips. "For your nerves," she says softly, though she doesn't look convinced herself. You swallow, and your mouth fills with bitter fire. It burns your throat all the way down. She wipes your mouth with a cloth, pats your shoulder once, then turns away. You feel lightheaded, sleepy, your heartbeat slows. Somewhere downstairs you hear the faint clink of glasses as your parents toast to the children's health. And tomorrow, if you're lucky, you'll wake up. You wake in a haze, the kind that makes it hard to tell whether you're still dreaming. The air is thick with the sour aftertaste of last night's tonic, your limbs heavy and useless under the scratchy wool blanket. Someone opens the curtain, letting in a slice of pale morning light that cuts across your bed like a knife. The nanny's voice floats in. "Up! Time for Sunday service!" And just like that, your body remembers how to move, not because you want to, but because not moving will lead to more consequences than you're ready to face today. Sunday in Victorian England was the one day of the week that belonged entirely to someone else. Your time, your thoughts, even your face. All of it belonged to God, or more accurately, to the adults around you who believed they were interpreting God's will on his behalf. It wasn't a day of rest. It was a day of rigid structure, stifling silences, and eternal hymns sung half a key too high by people too tired to believe them. First comes the dressing. Not your weekday best, no. This is Sunday best, which means extra buttons, tighter collars, and a hat that hasn't fit properly since Easter. If you're a girl, it also means gloves, ribbons, and shoes polished to a shine so blinding you'd think your soul depended on it. Because maybe, in some twisted way, it does. Your shoes squeak as you walk, each step echoing like a confession. The streets are filled with other families on the same forced march toward holiness. No skipping, no noise, no joy. You hold your prayer book like it's a fragile relic, even though it smells like old leather and mothballs. Some children, especially the ones in the poorer districts, go barefoot. Others trail behind, eyes hollow, already reciting the hymns under their breath to avoid being singled out. Church is not a refuge here. It's a checkpoint. Once inside, you're ushered to your seat. Children in one row, adults in another. Boys on one side, girls on the other. No speaking, no fidgeting, no looking around. The wooden pew beneath you is hard and unforgiving, and you have to sit with your spine perfectly straight for what feels like hours. The minister's voice drones through the air like fog, thick, monotone, full of words like wrath and damnation. You're not sure what most of it means, but you understand the tone. Be good or else. Victorian religion had little interest in making children feel loved by God. It was far more concerned with making sure they feared him. You were taught from the very start that you were born sinful, not metaphorically, literally, a small wriggling bundle of iniquity in need of constant correction. That's why you were punished, why you were ignored, why you were dressed like a 40-year-old banker at the age of 8. The theology was simple. The body is weak, the soul is flawed, and discipline is your only salvation. One fringe fact, some churches used sin charts for children where you'd record your wrongdoings during the week. Talking back, skipping chores, gluttony like sneaking a second biscuit, or even vanity, looking in the mirror too long. Each sin got a mark. Too many marks, and you were made to stand and recite a repentance prayer in front of the congregation. Think of it like spiritual public shaming, Victorian style. Sermons often included vivid descriptions of hell, flames, screams, eternal darkness. This wasn't metaphorical imagery for abstract thinking adults. This was what children actually believed might happen to them if they lied about breaking a teacup. Some churches even used props. One travelling preacher brought a heated iron to his service to demonstrate what eternal burning might feel like. He didn't touch the children with it, but he let it hover close enough that the lesson left a mark anyway. After the sermon, you endure another round of hymns. The organ wheezes, the congregation mumbles. Someone faints in the back, possibly from the heat, possibly from the sheer weight of moral pressure. If you're lucky, the service ends before your legs go numb. If not, you learn to suffer in silence. Suffering is part of the path, but the day isn't over. After church, you're not allowed to play. Sunday is a day of reflection, which means sitting in your best clothes reading the Bible, or listening to your father read it aloud while everyone else pretends to follow along. If your eyes wander, you're scolded. If you ask a question that isn't about scripture, you're silenced. Even laughter is considered inappropriate. Frivolity is the language of the ungodly. Some households banned toys on Sundays, others locked the piano. One historical account describes a father who nailed the toy chest shut every Saturday night and only removed the nails on Monday morning. That's how committed some Victorians were to the Sabbath. For children, it was less a day of worship and more a slow spiritual suffocation. The meals are subdued. No meat if you're particularly devout. No sweets. You eat in near silence, while someone, usually your mother, reads from a devotional book with all the warmth of a granite statue. Afterward, the older children go to Sunday school, which is just more religious instruction disguised as education. You sit through lessons on obedience, humility, the dangers of pride, and the eternal importance of never ever thinking for yourself. And then, finally, the day begins to fade. You sit near the hearth, uncomfortable in your wool clothes, eyelids heavier, back aching from all the hours of sitting perfectly still. You're tired, but you know better than to complain. You whisper your evening prayer, asking for forgiveness for sins you probably didn't commit, and crawl into bed hoping your dreams don't involve eternal fire. One curious scholarly debate. Some modern historians argue that this strict religious atmosphere gave rise to Victorian anxiety disorders, a culture-wide neurosis born of endless spiritual dread. Others say it gave children a moral compass, a sense of duty and restraint. But even among the defenders, few deny it came at a cost. Tonight, as the last candle is snuffed out, you feel a hollow space in your chest. Not sadness exactly, not fear. Something quieter, heavier. Like a question that can't be asked. You want to know if God really sees you, if he cares that you're tired, if he noticed that you tried hard today, but you don't ask, not even in your head. Because asking implies doubt, and doubt in Victorian England is just another sin waiting to be punished. Tomorrow the Sabbath will be over. You'll be allowed to laugh again. But tonight, you lie very still and very quiet, just in case God is listening. You wake to rain tapping lightly against the window pane, steady, rhythmic, and oddly soothing. It's one of those quiet grey mornings that almost feels peaceful, till you remember what day it is. Not Sunday, not school, not even chores. It's inspection day, and that means everything about you, your hands, your nails, your hair, your posture, your manners, is about to be examined like you're a piece of silverware pulled from a dusty drawer. Victorian childhood, if nothing else, was a constant performance. You weren't just expected to be good. You had to look good, act good, and represent your family's values in every detail of your being. Inspection days were the culmination of this bizarre little system, part moral check-in, part social conditioning, and all entirely soul-crushing. These inspections varied from house to house. In working-class homes, they were often informal but no less intense. Your mother might check your hands before supper, lifting your fingers like a prison warden inspecting contraband. In wealthier households, it was practically ceremonial. A governess or parent would summon you to the drawing room, make you stand under the watchful eye of a gas lamp, and begin the evaluation. Hands first, always the hands. Were they clean? Nails short? No ink stains from writing, no dirt from play? In a world without running water in every room, staying clean was no small task. It meant cold water from a jug, stiff brushes, harsh soap that made your skin crack, and towels that never quite dried anything. But none of that mattered if your hands didn't pass muster. Dirty nails were a moral failure. Cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was basically proof of it. Then came your hair, combed, neatly parted, no stray curls. Victorian hair etiquette was intense. Girls' hair had to be long, tidy and natural, though not too wild, while boys' hair was expected to be short, well-oiled, and parted like a geography textbook. Precisely down the centre or side, no deviations allowed. If your hair misbehaved, you were accused of being unruly. Yes, your hair could be rebellious, and yes, that rebellion could be punished. Teeth were inspected too, though not quite in the way you'd expect. Dental care was primitive. Most children brushed with salt ashes or a horrifying paste of soot and vinegar. Toothaches were handled with clove oil, prayers, or, if all else failed, extraction with pliers in the kitchen. But even with all this, your teeth had to be presentable. Yellow was tolerated, rotting was not. And if your breath was bad, well, that was simply impolite. Posture check. Stand up straight. No slouching. Shoulders are back, chin up, spine like an ironing board. This wasn't just about appearance, it was a moral statement. A child who slouched was seen as lazy, weak, possibly even dishonest. Some families took it to extremes, tying children to chairs with belts to train better posture or placing books on their heads during walks around the parlour. If the book fell, you started again. The goal wasn't just elegance, it was control. Then came the part everyone dreaded, the question. You were quizzed on everything from Bible verses to table manners. What's the capital of France? Who was the first king of England? How many times must you curtsy to a duchess? What's the proper way to ask for salt? If you hesitated, you were corrected. If you stumbled, you were embarrassed. If you got it wrong, you were punished, or worse, sent back to study while your siblings moved on to tea. And let's not forget clothing. On inspection day, your outfit had to be spotless. Hemlines straight, buttons fastened, shoes polished. In wealthier homes, a maid might have prepared your clothes, but you were responsible for how you wore them. A crooked bow? That was your failure. A missing button? Carelessness. Wrinkled sleeves? Signs of sloth. Clothes weren't just garments. They were a report card for your soul. This obsession with external order extended to behaviour too. You had to speak clearly but not loudly. Sit still, but not stiffly. Be cheerful but not too cheerful. That was considered frivolous. One etiquette book warned that boisterous laughter is a gateway to vulgarity. So yes, your happiness needed to be edited before being displayed. One truly quirky inspection method involved breath. Yes, your breath. Some mothers would instruct their children to exhale into a handkerchief and then sniff it, claiming they could detect moral failings by scent. Impure breath was thought to come from impure thoughts, and while that sounds like complete nonsense now, imagine being 9 years old and watching your mother try to smell your sins. And just to keep things interesting, inspection wasn't always announced. You might be pulled aside after dinner or during a walk. A sudden, "let me see those hands" could shatter whatever peace you were feeling. Surprise checks were common because, of course, morality wasn't something you turned on for show. It was supposed to be a permanent state. You were expected to be inspection ready at all times. But perhaps the strangest part of all was the applause that followed success. Not literal clapping, Victorians weren't that sentimental. But you might get a small nod, a tight-lipped, "well done," or the rarest of gems, "you're shaping up nicely." And somehow, after all the stress and scrutiny, those words felt like sunshine. You beamed. Not because you believed them, necessarily, but because for a moment you'd passed. You were safe. For now. Because, of course, none of it ever stopped. The next day brought another inspection. Another test. Another measurement of your cleanliness, your quietness, your conformity. And you knew, deep down, that the moment you slipped, the moment you relaxed or forgot or simply acted like a child, the eyes would return, and the judgment would be swift. So tonight, when the nanny wipes your hands with a cloth and straightens your collar one last time before bed, you don't flinch. You've already been inspected today. You passed, but just barely. You lie back on the mattress, spine still straight, hair smoothed down, lips pressed together. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Because in Victorian England, a child is never just a child. They are a constant project, a reflection of the household's pride, and a silent promise that nothing unsightly, undisciplined, or too alive will ever step out of line. There's a knock on the front door that evening. Firm, deliberate, the kind that makes everyone in the house sit up a little straighter. You hear your mother mutter something about company arriving early, and suddenly the place explodes into motion. The nanny rushes you upstairs, yanks a comb through your hair, and pulls your best jacket out from the wardrobe, one you haven't worn since the cousin with the unfortunate ears came to visit. That can only mean one thing: visitors are coming, and you, poor child, are about to become part of the Victorian ritual known as being paraded for social consumption. This is a special kind of torture. A performance within a performance. You're not just presenting your manners now, you're being weaponized. A clean, polite, well-dressed child was the ultimate social currency in Victorian England. You weren't a person so much as a proof of purchase, living evidence that your family was respectable, moral, and upwardly mobile. If you smiled at the right time, answered questions with enough confidence but not too much, and knew your psalms by number, your parents were praised. If you messed up, well, your governess might be dismissed by Monday. You're guided down the stairs like a show pony, one hand lightly pressed against the banister, the other hanging uselessly at your side because pockets are forbidden. The parlour is warm with coal heat and smells like lemon oil and overcooked beef. The guests are already seated, an older couple in heavy fabrics, and a younger woman with pinched features and a voice that could cut glass. There is no escape. Such a lovely child, one of them says, before you've even opened your mouth, which is rich, considering you haven't been allowed to speak yet. You stand perfectly still. You wait. You smile without showing teeth. That's important. Teeth are unseemly. Then come the questions. What books are you reading? Do you enjoy arithmetic? Can you recite the Lord's Prayer? Who is the monarch? What is the capital of Prussia? Do you enjoy your studies? Can you speak French? Say something in French. It's not a conversation. It's an examination with doilies. Your answers are crisp, short, pleasant. You've been trained for this moment. Like a pet dog expected to do tricks. Nod, speak, smile, sit. Good child. Somewhere in the background you hear the clink of teacups and the murmur of adults discussing estate matters, but your whole world has narrowed to this tiny, unbearable performance. And don't you dare fidget. Victorian etiquette manuals went to absurd lengths on how children should behave in company. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't interrupt. Don't chew with your mouth open. Don't slouch. Don't talk too much. Don't talk too little. Don't display too much emotion. Don't stare. Don't forget to thank everyone. Don't exist too loudly, basically. Girls were expected to be sweetness incarnate, curtsying, smiling, and responding with breathy modesty. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. I enjoy embroidery very much. Meanwhile, boys had to appear clever but not boastful, serious but not sullen, intelligent but not too intelligent. God forbid you correct an adult on anything, even if they mispronounced your name. One historical etiquette guide warned that a child who speaks too often may be thought precocious, and precocity is the enemy of charm. Translation: don't be interesting, be appropriate. Meanwhile, in the servant corridors and kitchens of Britain, children were behaving like actual children, laughing, yelling, stealing lumps of sugar when no one was looking. But upstairs? Upstairs you were expected to embody the family name in miniature. You were porcelain with a pulse. Some households even held practice salons, mock social gatherings where children would rehearse how to greet visitors, pour tea, respond to compliments, and bow just the right number of inches, too low and it looked desperate, too shallow and it looked disrespectful. A correct bow was a mathematical equation. Performance of geometry and fear. And if you failed in public, if you tripped over your words or spilled your tea or laughed too loudly, the punishment didn't always come immediately. Sometimes it was a quiet, seething look from across the room. Other times it came later, in the form of an early bedtime, a meal without dessert, or a chilly lecture about how disappointed we all are. One quirky fringe fact: in some upper-class homes, children were trained to make themselves scarce on cue. If a visitor arrived unannounced and the child wasn't properly dressed or composed, they were expected to vanish. Through a side door, a servant's hallway, a cupboard under the stairs, wherever. Some were even instructed to hide in the garden or behind folding screens until the adults gave the all clear. It was like living inside a Jane Austen-themed stealth mission. But tonight you survive. You answer correctly, you don't drop the biscuit. You remember to curtsy. And just before you're dismissed, one of the guests says the words that make it all worthwhile, for the adults anyway. What a well-brought-up child. That's it. That's the goal. Not happy, not curious, not loved, just well brought up. The room exhales, you're excused. You return upstairs like a prisoner released on parole, hands trembling slightly from the effort of being perfect for an hour. You collapse onto your bed without removing your shoes. The nanny tuts and pulls them off for you. "You did well," she whispers, as she tucks the blanket up to your chin. "No mistakes." And yet you don't feel proud. You feel hollow, like you've left part of yourself behind in the parlour. Maybe your voice or the way you laugh when no one's watching. Because in Victorian England, the performance never really ends. It just moves from one room to the next. Tomorrow someone else will arrive. Another round of polite questions, coded praise, and hidden judgment. And once again, you'll put on the face they want to see, because being a child here isn't about growing up. It's about becoming invisible in the right ways. It starts with a cough, a small one, hardly noticeable. You clear your throat and move on, but then it returns the next morning, drier, deeper, clinging to your ribs like a whisper that won't leave. No one panics. Children cough, the house is damp, the sheets were cold, your nanny gives you some foul-tasting syrup and tells you to be brave. She pats your head, pulls the blanket tighter and dims the lamp. In a Victorian household, sickness is just another thread in the tapestry. Expected, inevitable, and quietly terrifying. Everyone knows what illness can do, especially to children, but no one speaks of it until it's too late. It hovers in the air like soot, always present, always settling. By the end of the week, your skin is warm to the touch, your appetite has vanished, and there's a rattle in your chest that even you know sounds wrong. A doctor is called, which means you're officially ill enough to justify the cost. He arrives smelling of wool, pipe smoke, and something metallic. He carries a bag that clicks open like a coffin lid and pulls out instruments that look like they belong in a butcher's kit. He listens to your breathing frowns, says something about inflammation, and prescribes bed rest, beef tea, and, of course, more syrup. No one says what they're really thinking, but the look on your mother's face says it all. She's already bracing for the worst. Victorian England was no stranger to death, especially among children. In some areas, nearly half of all children didn't survive to adulthood. It wasn't just the poor who lost their little ones. Even in wealthy homes with full-time nurses and access to doctors, diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, consumption, and typhoid could sweep in and take a child in a matter of days. And when it happened, families were expected to carry on. Grief was allowed, but only in the proper way. Mothers wore black. Fathers stood straighter. The child's possessions were cleared away quickly, lest they provoke too much emotion. In some households, portraits were commissioned then of the deceased, painted from memory or, more often, based on post-mortem photographs. Yes, they dressed your lifeless body in Sunday best, propped you up, and took a final picture. It was macabre. It was haunting. It was normal. One deeply disturbing fringe practice was keeping a lock of the child's hair, sometimes braided into jewellery or pressed between pages of a Bible. Some families made entire mourning brooches, miniature cameos containing their child's hair woven into tiny, delicate patterns. It was beautiful. It was devastating, and it was one of the few ways grief was permitted to live on, discreetly, like a scar hidden under lace. But what about before the child died? What happened in those long, dim days of waiting? The sick room was dimly lit, the windows usually kept closed to avoid a draught, which was considered more dangerous than stale air. Curtains were drawn, voices were hushed, visitors were discouraged. The child, you, lay still, pale and shrinking beneath the sheets. Your siblings weren't allowed in, the family's attention narrowed to your bed and your breath. Sometimes a clergyman came to read scripture. Sometimes a doctor returned with another bottle of opiate-laced syrup that made the world blurry around the edges. And sometimes nothing was done at all. Just long hours of waiting, listening to the creak of the floorboards and the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Children were rarely told they were dying. Instead, they were told to be brave, to rest, to pray. Some asked if they would get better. Others knew the answer, but asked anyway. Occasionally a nurse or sibling would break and whisper the truth, but mostly substitution. Death came quietly, often in the night, while the rest of the house held its breath. And then, just like that, the child was gone. There was a funeral, of course, small, tasteful, religious. The child was laid to rest in a family plot or churchyard, often with other siblings already there. If the family had money, there might be a tiny marble headstone. If not, the grave might go unmarked. Either way, mourning was not open-ended. A mother was expected to wear black for a year, but life resumed quickly. There were other children. There were appearances to maintain. The emotional detachment wasn't always coldness. Often it was self-preservation. Victorian parents lost so many children that they sometimes avoided forming strong attachments in the first place. Infants were kept at a distance not only by nurses and wet nurses, but emotionally. If the child died, it hurt less, or so they told themselves. One scholarly debate today centres around this idea. Did Victorian parents truly love their children the way we do now? I must say yes. They felt the same emotions but were forced to survive differently. Others argue that high mortality reshaped affection into something more utilitarian, more restrained. Not a lack of love, but a form of love too afraid to show its face. You can see it in the literature of the time. Children in novels are often moral symbols, not people. When they die, it's seen as beautiful, even redemptive. Little Nell, Tiny Tim, Beth March. Their deaths are portrayed as noble sacrifices, not tragedies. Real Victorian children read those books and saw their fate reflected back at them. Purity equals fragility, equals early death. And yet not every child died. Some survived the fevers, the infections, the leeches and tonics, but even then, they rarely emerged unscathed. The survivor might have a lifelong limp, a hollowed chest or chronic fatigue. Some bore emotional scars, haunted by the memory of lost siblings or the lingering sense that they were only ever one cough away from vanishing too. Tonight, you lie in bed with the blanket pulled to your chin. You're not ill, not today, but the memory of that 1 week, that long cough, the way your mother paced outside your door never quite leaves you. You remember the bottle of syrup, the priest's visit, the sound of your name whispered like a prayer and a warning all at once. You survived, but not every child did, and you carry that with you. Because in Victorian England, childhood was a fragile flame, flickering, trembling, and always just one breath away from going out. So here you are. The lights are low, the house is quiet, and the fire in the hearth has long since turned to embers. You've survived 25 nights of cough syrup, corsets, chimney sweeps, and social inspections. Congratulations, honestly. That's no small feat. Victorian childhood wasn't something you grew through so much as something you endured, like a fever you had to wait out. And now, as the final echoes of all those rigid expectations settle into silence, it's time to finally exhale. It's a strange comfort, knowing that the world moved on, that children today can cry without shame, run without corsets, speak without rehearsing, and while no era is perfect, we've still got helicopter parents and gluten-free everything to deal with, at least we've come a long way from arsenic tonics and hiding your personality under a lace collar. But you still carry it, don't you? Some little piece of that legacy passed down through quiet rules and generational sighs. Sit up straight. Don't speak out of turn, be good, be still, be less. Even now part of you flinches when you make too much noise or feel too much joy or say something without permission. That's the shadow of the Victorian child in all of us. So tonight, let that go. Shake off the starch, breathe deeper than a corset would allow, pretend the nanny is off duty. Let yourself laugh, even if no one else is awake. And know that even in the stiffest, most repressive times, children always found tiny ways to rebel, to play, to dream like now. As your eyes grow heavy and your mind drifts far from cobblestones and hymn books towards something soft, unmeasured and free,